On a chilly autumn night in the sleepy suburban town of Rosewood, the air hung heavy with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Maya Turner moved through the stillness, her sneakers whispering against the pavement with each deliberate step. She had chosen this place deliberately, a refuge from the chaos that had defined her life. For over a decade, Rosewood was a picture-perfect snapshot of Americana. Manicured lawns stretching out beneath the glow of porch lights, white picket fences standing like silent sentinels, and the laughter of children on bicycles echoing faintly in the daylight hours. It was a world apart from the war-torn cities and shadowy underworlds she'd once navigated as a CIA operative, a place where the biggest scandals involved misplaced pets or the local diner's refusal to revive its beloved pumpkin pie. For someone who had spent years dodging bullets and unraveling lies, the simplicity felt like a mirage, beautiful, fragile, and perhaps too good to be true. Maya's dark eyes flickered across her surroundings, absorbing every detail with a precision honed by years of survival. The faint rustle of a curtain in a nearby window, the soft creak of a porch swing swaying in the breeze, the way a parked car's shadow stretched just a little too far into the street. Nothing escaped her notice. She wasn't paranoid, she was conditioned. Her time in the agency had rewired her instincts, turning every quiet moment into a battlefield of possibilities. She could still feel the weight of her past clinging to her like damp fabric. After a storm, faces of allies she'd lost, the city she'd watched crumble, the enemies whose motives she'd unraveled only to find they were pawns in someone else's game. That weight had grown unbearable, pressing down on her until the thrill of the chase became a dull ache, until exhaustion seeped into her bones and refused to let go. So she'd walked away or tried to. Rosewood was her attempt at a new chapter, a chance to shed the aliases, the disguises, the relentless vigilance. Yet, as she inhaled the crisp night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done with her. For a fleeting moment, she let herself sink into the rhythm of her walk. The cool breeze brushed against her cheeks, tugging at the edges of her jacket, and she tilted her head back to gaze at the scattering of stars peeking through the treetops. She wanted to believe in this peace, to let it wrap around her like a blanket and silence the noise in her mind. But then she felt a prickle along the back of her neck, sharp and insistent. It wasn't the usual curiosity she'd grown accustomed to since arriving in Rosewood. The sit-along glances from neighbors who wondered about the newcomer with no clear story. This was different, focused, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her pulse quickened. Though her steps remained steady, she didn't turn her head, didn't betray the shift in her awareness. Instead, she cataloged the signs, the faint hum of an engine idling too long at the intersection ahead, the subtle flicker of a porch light extinguishing, as if someone had stepped away from a window. She filed them away, pieces of a puzzle she wasn't yet ready to solve. Blocks away, Todd Reynolds sat hunched in his patrol car, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. The dim glow of the dashboard illuminated his face, sharp jawline clenched, eyes narrowed into slits as he tracked Maya's solitary figure. He'd noticed her before, this woman who moved through Rosewood like she owned it, her posture radiating a quiet confidence that grated against his nerves. She didn't flinch when his cruiser rolled by, didn't cast nervous glances over her shoulder like the townsfolk he'd spent years policing. To Todd, that alone was an affront. He'd joined the force with dreams of glory-cracking high-profile cases, earning medals pinned to his chest, becoming the kind of cop people respected. But reality had delivered a bitter twist. 10 years in, he was still circling the same streets, handing out tickets for expired meters and dragging slurring drunks out of bar fights. His record was a patchwork of complaints, excessive force, misconduct, whispers of abuse, but the system had a way of shielding its own. The accusations never stuck, though they left a stain that kept promotions out of reach, fueling a resentment that simmered just beneath his carefully maintained facade. Todd's life hadn't unfolded the way he'd planned. He'd imagined himself as a protector, a gatekeeper of order in a town he saw as his domain. Rosewood, with its quaint charm and predictable routines, was supposed to stay unchanged as to control, but the world had shifted under his feet. New faces moved in, old traditions faded, and with every passing year, he felt his grip slipping. Maya Turner was the latest disruption, an outsider who didn't fit his rigid vision of who belonged. The first time he'd seen her, it was just a passing irritation on another stranger walking alone at night. But something about her lingered in his mind, the way she held herself, shoulders squared, eyes scanning her surroundings with an alertness he recognized from his academy days. Threat awareness, they'd called it. She wasn't like the other stymied housewives or carefree kids. She was different, and different, to Todd, meant dangerous. Tonight, that irritation had hardened into something uglier. His shift had been slow. The radio silence save for the occasional crackle of static, and the monotony gnawed at him. He needed an outlet, a way to reassert the authority he felt slipping away. His gaze locked on Maya, and a decision crystallized in his mind. She didn't belong in his town, not on his watch. He'd make sure she understood that. The cruiser's engine purred as he eased it forward, tires crunching softly against the asphalt. He didn't need a reason to stop her. His badge was reason enough. In his world, power wasn't just a tool, it was a right, one he wielded with a certainty that left no room for doubt. As Maya rounded a corner, the streetlight overhead cast her shadow long and thin across the pavement. She heard the low rumble of the approaching vehicle before she saw it, the sound reverberating through the quiet night. Her muscles tensed, but her expression remained calm, almost serene. She'd faced worse than this: gunfights in dusty alleys, interrogations in windowless rooms, betrayals that cut deeper than any blade. Whatever was coming, she'd handle it. The cruiser pulled alongside her, its headlights slicing through the darkness, and Todd's voice barked out, sharp and commanding. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Maya paused, turning slowly to face him, her movements deliberate, controlled. Todd stepped out of the car, his boots thudding against the ground with a weight that matched his ego. Up close, she could see the lines etched into his face, years of frustration carved into his skin the way. His hand rested near his holster, a silent threat. "What's someone like you doing out here this late?" he demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. His eyes raked over her, searching for something to justify the hostility coiling in his chest. "Walking," she replied simply, her voice steady, unyielding. Inside, her mind raced, assessing him as she'd assessed countless threats before. He was angry, volatile, a man clinging to a power he didn't fully understand. She saw it in the twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers flexed near his weapon. But she also saw something else, a fear, buried deep beneath the bravado, fear of losing control, of being irrelevant. It was a dangerous combination. Todd sneered, stepping closer. "You don't look like you belong around here. Where you from?" His words were a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. To him, she was an intruder, a stain on the pristine order he'd convinced himself he upheld. Maya didn't flinch, didn't back away. She met his gaze, her silence louder than any retort. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Todd's hand shot out, a fist aimed at her face, driven by a fury he couldn't name. But Maya's faster instincts, honed by years of training, kicked in, and she sidestepped the blow with a fluid grace that left him stumbling. Before he could recover, her hand darted forward, fingers pressing against a precise point on his neck. A jolt surged through him, not pain, but something electric, overwhelming. His knees buckled, and he hit the ground, gasping, eyes wide with shock. He hadn't seen it coming, couldn't comprehend what she'd done. For the first time in years, Todd Reynolds felt powerless, stripped bare by a force he didn't understand. Maya stood over him, her breath even, her expression unreadable. She could have ended it, there could have unleashed the full extent of the abilities she'd kept hidden since leaving the agency. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving him sprawled on the pavement, the night swallowing her figure as if she'd never been there. Todd's chest heaved, his mind reeling. He'd wanted to teach her a lesson, to reclaim his authority, but all he'd done was expose his own fragility. In the days that followed, whispers rippled through Rosewood. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the cop who'd been brought to his knees, about the mysterious woman who'd vanished into the night. For Maya, it was a reminder that peace was an illusion, one she'd have to fight for. For Todd, it was a reckoning, a bitter taste of the justice he'd dodged for too long. The incident laid bare a truth neither could ignore. Power, when abused, invited consequences. And justice, though delayed, had a way of finding its mark. The night stretched out in a quiet, oppressive stillness, the kind that weighed on the chest and sharpened every sound. Todd Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on the steering wheel, his breath fogging faintly in the cool March air. He'd been circling these streets for hours, his territory, his domain, a small town where everyone knew their place, or at least they were supposed to. His eyes, narrowed and restless, caught sight of her silhouette up ahead, moving with a calm defiance that gnawed at him instantly. She wasn't hurrying, wasn't glancing around nervously like most people did when they felt the law creeping up behind them. She just walked, steady and unbothered, as if the world bent to her rhythm instead of the other way around. That alone was enough to spark something sharp in Todd's gut, a flicker of irritation that quickly hardened into resolve. He pressed his foot gently on the gas, letting the car ease forward with a slow, deliberate roll, the engine's low growl cutting through the silence like a predator stalking prey. He flicked on the headlights, twin beams slicing through the darkness to bathe the cracked pavement ahead in stark white light. She didn't flinch, didn't even pause to acknowledge the glow creeping up behind her. Most folks, even the innocent ones, would have reacted by now, cast a quick glance over their shoulder, slowed their steps, or stiffened just enough to show they knew he was there. Not her. Her stride remained steady, her shoulders square, her head held high. Todd's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing around the wheel. She knew he was there. He could see it in the subtle way her breathing shifted, the faint tilt of her posture as she adjusted to his presence. It wasn't ignorance keeping her from reacting, it was intent. She was daring him to make a move, testing the boundaries of his authority, and that lit a cold fire in his chest. He didn't like being tested, not in his town, not on his watch. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he nudged the wheel, guiding the car closer to the curb, the tires whispering against the asphalt. He wasn't in a rush, had all night if he wanted it. This was his domain, and he'd decide who got to walk these streets feeling untouchable. Ahead of him, Maya Turner moved with the same measured grace she always carried, her boots tapping a soft, unbroken rhythm against the sidewalk. She'd felt the patrol car long before its headlights caught here, a low hum in the air, a shift in the stillness that prickled the back of her neck. She'd known it was coming, the way you know a storm's brewing before the clouds even roll in. The pace was too deliberate, too calculated, not the casual sweep of a routine patrol, but something heavier, something with intent. She kept her breathing steady, her body loose, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, though, her mind was already racing, piecing together the puzzle of this moment. Who was he? What did he want? Was this just boredom, or something more personal? If it were routine, he'd have passed her by now, maybe tossed her a fleeting glance before disappearing into the night. But he lingered, his presence a weight pressing against her back, watching her, waiting for her to crack. She'd met men like him before too many times, in too many placemen who thrived on control, who saw power as a weapon to wield rather than a duty to uphold. She knew how fast this could spiral, how one wrong step could turn a quiet night into a battle she didn't want to fight. The street stretched out before her, lined with crooked streetlights that flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the pavement. The distant chirping of crickets hummed faintly, a fragile thread of sound in the otherwise suffocating quiet. Maya kept walking, her hands loose at her sides, her jacket swaying faintly with each step. She didn't need to turn around to know he was close, no clothes enough to see the scuff marks on her boots, the faint outline of her bag slung over her shoulder, the way her hair caught the light. She could feel his eyes on her, probing, searching for a weakness to exploit. Then came the flashered and blue lights snapping to life, slicing through the darkness like a blade. The siren followed, a sharp, piercing wail that shattered the night and echoed off the empty storefronts lining the road. Maya slowed her steps, exhaling a soft, controlled breath as she came to a stop. She didn't spin around in surprise or stumble in panic. She just stood there, rooted to the spot, letting the moment settle around her like dust after a storm. Behind her, the car door creaked open, the sound grating against the stillness, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground. "Evening," Todd said, his voice cutting through the air like a whip, clipped and commanding. more an order than a greeting. Maya turned slowly, her face a mask of calm, her dark eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. "Officer," she replied, her tone even, steady, giving nothing away. Todd stood there, his broad frame filling the space between the car and the curb, his hand resting near his belt in a way that was meant to look relaxed but screamed intention. He studied her, his lips twitching into a faint, smug curl, as if he'd already won something just by making her stop. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken tension, a silent battlefield drawn in the shadows of the flickering streetlights. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice laced with a sharpness that didn't match the casual words. The crickets droned on in the distance, their song a faint counterpoint to the growing weight of the moment. Maya didn't shift, didn't fidget. She'd been here before, not just on quiet streets like this, but in war zones halfway across the world, where power wasn't just flexed but weaponized. Back then, the stakes were clearer, the enemies more obvious. Here, in this sleepy little town she'd called home for the past few years, it felt murkier, more insidious. She looked into Todd's eyes and saw the same hunger she'd seen in men, with rifles slung over their shoulders, a need to dominate, to bend others to their will. His stance was rigid, his chest puffed out slightly, exuding an authority that wasn't about keeping the peace, but about asserting his own existence. "Came out for a little walk, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with something predatory, a glint of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. "Bit late for that, don't you think?" Maya held his gaze, her posture relaxed, but her senses razor-sharp, every nerve attuned to the shift in his demeanor. "It's a quiet town," she said simply, her voice smooth as glass. "Figured I'd enjoy the fresh air." Todd let out a dry, humorless chuckle, the sound grating against the night. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face for a crack, a hint of unease, anything he could latch onto. "You live around here?" he pressed, his boots scraping the pavement as he shifted his weight, closing the distance just enough to make the air feel tighter. "I do," she said, unflinching. "For how long?" "Long enough." Her answers were short, clipped, offering nothing more than what he asked. Todd's jaw ticked, a faint muscle jumping beneath the stubble on his cheek. "Funny," he said, his voice hardening. "I know most people in this town. Can't say I've seen you before." Maya didn't rise to the bait. She'd learned long ago that men like Todd didn't care about the truth, he cared about winning. "Like I said," she replied, her tone still even, "I keep to myself." His eyes darkened, frustration simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't giving him what he wanted, no stammering, no nervous glances, no deference. It prickled at him, this woman standing there like she wasn't fazed by his badge, his car, his presence. He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of barely contained irritation. "Gonna need to see some ID," he said, his voice dropping into a colder, more official register. Maya had seen this coming from the moment the headlights hit her back. She knew her rights, knew he had no legal ground to demand it, no probable cause to justify the request. But she also knew refusing would only escalate things. And while she wasn't afraid to stand her ground, she wasn't in the mood to turn this into a war. With a single nod, she reached into her pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, pulling out her wallet with the precision of someone who'd been trained to keep control in chaos. She slid the ID out and held it toward him, her hand steady, her eyes never leaving his. Todd took it, but he didn't glance at it right away. Instead, he held it between his fingers, letting the silence stretch. A petty power play to remind her who was in charge. Maya stood still, her breath even, waiting him out. Finally, he flicked his eyes down to the card, scanning her name, her address, her face in the tiny photo. It should have ended there, a routine check, a quick dismissal. But Todd wasn't done. "You got a last name to go with that, Maya?" he asked, his tone shifting into something mocking, almost taunting. She didn't flinch. "You're holding my ID, officer," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, his lip curled, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. She wasn't rattled, wasn't scrambling to please him, and that infuriated him more than he'd expected. He flipped the ID back to her with a casual flick of his wrist, but as she reached for it, his gaze dropped to the bag on her shoulder. His smirk widened, slow and deliberate. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice low, dripping with insinuation. Maya's grip on her ID stayed firm as she tucked it back into her pocket, her movements unhurried. She'd known this was coming the moment he'd stepped out of the car. She'd seen the hunger in his eyes, the need to push, to prod, to find something he could use. Personal belongings, she said evenly, adjusting the strap slightly. Her fingers brushing the worn canvas. Todd tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the streetlight's glow. Mind if I take a look? It wasn't a question, it was a challenge, a line drawn in the dirt. Maya met his gaze, her voice steady as stone. Do you have probable cause, officer? The air between them tightened, a taut wire ready to snap. Todd's fingers twitched near his belt, a muscle pulsing in his jaw. She'd given him nothing, no fear, no hesitation, no submission, and that was a direct affront to everything he stood for. His stance shifted, his body leaning forward just enough to loom over her, his shadow stretching long and dark across the pavement. I don't need probable cause if I think something's suspicious, he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word laced with menace. Maya exhaled slowly, feeling the shift in the air, the tipping point where tension could spill into something uglier. She'd faced worse, far worse, but that didn't mean she'd let this slide without a fight. Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, she said, her tone unwavering. You don't have the right to search my property. Todd's face darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. He hadn't expected this, and the calm defiance, not the pushback. Most people would have folded by now, stammering apologies or handing over whatever he asked just to make it go away. But not her. She stood there, unflinching, her words a quiet rebuke to his authority. Probable cause? He repeated, his voice thick with disbelief, as if the very idea offended him. He took a step closer, his boots thudding against the pavement, his presence swallowing the space between them. Lady, I don't know what kind of attitude you think you can have out here, but when an officer gives you a lawful order, you follow it. Maya's jaw tightened, a faint ripple of irritation breaking through her calm exterior. A lawful order requires legal justification, she said, her voice still steady, her eyes locked on his. You don't have one. Todd's fingers flexed near his belt, his frustration boiling over into something colder, more dangerous. He leaned in, his breath hot against the night air, his voice dropping to a slow, menacing drawl. Let me explain something to you, he said, each word deliberate, heavy with threat. When I say something looks suspicious, that's all the cause I need. Now, you can make this easy and let me do my job, or you can make it real difficult for yourself. The words hung there, a loaded threat wrapped in the guise of duty. Maya didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch, her mind racing through the possibilities. She could feel the anger radiating off him, the bruised pride of a man unused to being challenged. He was itching for her to push back harder, to give him an excuse to escalate, to turn this quiet standoff into something he could control with force. She adjusted the strap of her bag again, her movements slow and deliberate, a silent refusal to bend. I have nothing to hide, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. But I won't consent to an unlawful search. Todd shook his head, a sharp, incredulous laugh escaping him. Unbelievable, he muttered, his eyes boring into hers with a mix of contempt and fury. You got something in there you don't want me to find. His tone was accusatory now, a last-ditch effort to rattle her, to force a reaction. Maya's patience was fraying, but she kept it locked down, her expression as unreadable as ever. I have my rights, Officer Reynolds, she said, emphasizing his name, letting it hang in the air like a quiet reprimand. You should know that better than anyone. The use of his name hit him like a slap, his jaw clenching tight, his hand hovering near his belt as if itching to act. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a silent war of wills, the night closing in around them. The lesson was clear, etched into the tension between them. Justice wasn't just a badge or a tight light, was a line that could be crossed, a boundary that power could twist and bend. Todd had crossed it, wielding his authority like a club, blind to the consequences of his overreach. And Maya, standing firm, was a living reminder that those consequences existed, that unchecked power could meet resistance, that the law wasn't his to rewrite. The crickets sang on, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath the flickering streetlights. As the standoff stretched into the night, teetering on the edge of something neither could fully predict. As the night stretched on, the tension in the air thickened, coiling around Maya like a living thing. She stood there, her boots planted firmly on the cracked asphalt, every nerve in her body humming with alertness. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a faint stir across the street, a shadow of movement that sliced through the stillness. A curtain twitched in a dimly lit window, the fabric swaying as though brushed by a hesitant hand. The porch light flickered, its weak glow bouncing off something glassy, a pair of binoculars, perhaps, or the lens of a watchful eye. For a fleeting heartbeat, hope surged within her, warm and fragile, lighting up the dark corners of her mind. A witness, someone who could tip the scales, who could unravel the tangled mess she was caught in. Her chest tightened with the possibility, her breath hitching as she imagined a door swinging open, a voice cutting through the night to call out the truth. But just as quickly as that spark flared, it guttered out. The curtain dropped back into place, heavy and final, like a guillotine slicing through her fleeting optimism. No creak of a door followed, no footsteps echoed down the quiet street. Whoever lingered behind that window had seen enough anew to understand the stakes, enough to choose the safety of silence over the risk of involvement. Maya's stomach twisted, a bitter knot of disappointment settling there, though it wasn't a surprise. She'd learned this lesson years ago, etched into her bones through countless moments of betrayal and indifference. Most people, when faced with wrongdoing, preferred the comfort of turning away. Justice, she'd come to realize, was a rare and fragile thing, easily abandoned when the cost grew too high. Todd, though, had seen it too, his head jerked toward the house, his sharp eyes narrowing as they traced the now-still curtain, his lips pressed into a tight, thin line, a storm brewing behind his clenched jaw. When he turned back to her, the irritation that had simmered in his gaze sharpened into something uglier, impatience gnawing at his composure, frustration clawing its way to the surface, and beneath it all, a deep, pulsing anger. He'd had a plan, a script he'd expected her to follow. In his world, she was supposed to bend, to shrink, to crumble beneath his authority like so many others had. He'd wanted her to be pliable, a puppet dancing on his strings. But Maya was forged from sterner stuff. Her defiance wasn't just a crack in his control, it was a gaping wound. And for a man like Todd, that was a sin he couldn't forgive. The shift came like lightning splitting the sky. One moment, he stood there, his body vibrating with barely contained fury, his breath puffing out in shallow, ragged bursts. The next, his hand lashed out, fingers snapping shut around her wrist with a grip that bit into her skin, bruising and unyielding. Maya didn't think, she reacted. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, years of instinct and muscle memory surging to life in a single, fluid motion. She twisted her wrist sharply, angling it with practiced precision, just enough to slip free without wasting energy. His fingers clutched at empty air, his hold collapsing as she pulled back. For a split second, Todd froze, his eyes widening in stunned disbelief, as though the world had tilted off its axis. Maya stepped back, deliberate and controlled, putting a careful distance between them. Her muscles tensed, coiled like a spring, ready to move again if needed. Her breathing stayed steady, her pulse a calm rhythm tapping against her ribs. But Todd was a different story. His face darkened, a flush of red creeping up his neck like wildfire. His hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening as his breath came in short, harsh gasps. She'd slipped from his grasp worse. She'd made him look powerless. For a man whose entire identity hinged on dominance, that was a blow he couldn't stomach. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the moment of decision flickering in his eyes. His stance shifted, his fingers twitching toward his belt, and Maya knew, with a clarity that chilled her to the core, that he was about to cross a line. Todd's face twisted into a mask of rage as he ripped the radio from his shoulder, his movements jerky and forceful. He jammed the button down with his thumb, his voice barking out, sharp and commanding. "This is Officer Reynolds," he snapped, each word dripping with authority. "I've got a suspect resisting an officer, requesting immediate backup." The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut, her stomach lurching as the reality sank in. She'd known this could happen, had felt the shadow of it looming from the moment his patrol car had slowed beside her. its headlights cutting through the dusk like a predator's gaze. But hearing it, listening to him twist the truth so effortlessly, so casually, ignited a jagged spike of frustration in her chest. This was how it worked, how the narrative flipped in an instant. One call, one lie, and suddenly the victim became the villain, the defender branded as the threat. It was a stark reminder of the cost of power unchecked, a lesson in how justice could be warped by those who wielded it carelessly. Her mind raced, spinning through every option, every possible path forward. She had minutes, maybe seconds, before the reinforcements arrived, their sirens already a faint wail in the distance. She didn't know if they'd come seeking the truth or if they'd simply fall in line behind Todd, their loyalty blinding them to reason. The air between them shifted as he released the radio button, his face flushed with a fury he could barely contain. His breathing grew uneven, his fingers twitching near his belt before finally closing around the baton at his hip. Maya watched it unfold in slow motion, the aggressive snap of his hand, the way his grip tightened around the handle, the quick flick of his wrist as he yanked it free. She'd seen this dance before, lived it in moments that still haunted her dreams, and she knew what came next. Todd didn't pause. He lunged, swinging the baton in a wide, reckless arc aimed at her ribs. It was a brutal strike, fueled by raw power and intent to harm, but it was clumsy, unrefined. He wasn't trained for real combat, relied on fear, on the expectation that his prey would cower before the blow landed. Maya was no such prey. She moved in an instant, pivoting on the ball of her foot, her body flowing like water to let the baton slice through empty air. The weapon whistled past, its momentum dragging Todd forward, his balance faltering as he stumbled. She didn't hesitate. Stepping into the gap he'd left, she acted with surgical precision, her left hand seizing his wrist, her right driving the heel of her palm into his forearm. His fingers spasmed, the baton slipping from his grasp to clatter against the pavement with a hollow, defeated ring. Todd grunted, a sound thick with frustration, his body recoiling as he tried to regain his footing. But Maya was faster. She shifted behind him, twisting his arm with just enough force to drop him to his knees. He let out a strangled yell, his free hand scrabbling against the rough asphalt as he fought to brace himself. She tightened her hold, keeping him pinned, her movements measured and deliberate. She had no desire to hurt him, only to stop him, to keep the situation from spiraling further. "Let me go," he roared, his voice raw and ragged, his body thrashing beneath her grip. His breath came in uneven bursts, his fury a living thing straining against her control. "You're assaulting an officer." Maya stayed silent, her focus locked on maintaining her hold. Words wouldn't reach him, no, was too far gone, swallowed by his own rage and wounded pride. His struggles grew wilder, his boots scraping against the pavement, his muscles trembling with the effort to break free. This wasn't how it was supposed to go for him. He was the one with the badge, the one with the power, or so he'd believed, to be brought low. Pinned and helpless by a woman who refused to fear him was a humiliation that gnawed at his core. His breaths grew harsher, mingling with the cool night air, and beneath her hands, she could feel the tremor of his rage, unfiltered and dangerous. She'd faced men like him before, men who lashed out when their authority frayed, who let their emotions turn them into loose cannons. She knew how fast this could spiral, how quickly a bruised ego could push someone to violence beyond reason. Todd thrashed again, a guttural yell ripping from his throat as he twisted violently, desperate to shake her off. "This is your last chance, lady," he spat, his voice hoarse and strained. "Let me go," or his threat died as the distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the night like a blade. They both froze, the sound hanging heavy between them, their breathing the only rhythm in the sudden stillness. Then Todd exhaled, a slow, jagged breath, and a grin crept across his face, crooked and triumphant. Despite his position, "Hear that?" he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "Backup's coming, and when they get here, you're done." Maya didn't flinch, but she felt the weight of his words settle over her. She could see it playing out, the story he'd spin, the way he'd twist every detail to paint her as the aggressor. It wouldn't matter that he'd struck first, that he'd escalated a confrontation she'd tried to avoid. Once his fellow officers arrived, once they saw him on the ground, his uniform scuffed and his pride battered, they'd close ranks. The truth would be buried beneath their assumptions. justice drowned out by the clatter of boots and the crackle of radios. Her heart thudded against her ribs, her mind racing through every possible move. She could hold her ground, keep him restrained, try to plead her case when the others arrived. But that was a gambly or reckless one. Men like Todd always had allies. A brotherhood forged not in truth, but in loyalty to the badge. The sirens grew closer, their wail a countdown to a choice she couldn't avoid. She loosened her grip just enough to step back, putting space between them, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't giving up, she was buying time, recalculating, searching for a way to reclaim the narrative before it was too late. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Power, when abused, didn't just bend justice, it broke it, leaving the innocent to pick up the pieces. The moment the first patrol car tore around the corner, its tires screeching against the asphalt like a banshee's wail, Todd Reynolds lurched upward, scrambling to his feet with a clumsy stagger. His chest heaved as he whirled to face her, his breaths ragged and uneven, each one a testament to the storm raging inside him. His eyes burned with a wild, almost feral gleam, not of victory, though he might have thought it so, but of something darker, a molten mix of fury, shame, and a deep, festering hatred for what had just unfolded. His hands trembled violently, not from any trace of fear, but from the raw, unfiltered emotion coursing through him. A venomous cocktail brewed from the humiliation of being brought low. He opened his mouth, lips parting as if to unleash a torrent of words, to twist the narrative into a weapon he could wield, to reclaim the power he felt slipping through his fingers like sand. But before a single syllable could escape, the piercing cry of sirens swallowed the night, and the scene shifted. The police cruisers skidded to a halt, their doors bursting open with a synchronized urgency that shattered the stillness. Suddenly, Maya Turner wasn't standing alone anymore. The air thrummed with the chaos of rival sirens winding down from their deafening howl, replaced by the staccato pulse of red and blue lights ricocheting off the shadowed facades of the suburban homes. The quiet street, once cloaked in the soft hum of evening, now buzzed with an electric tension, the kind that settles into your bones and whispers of consequences yet to unfold. The lights carved through the darkness, their rhythmic flicker a silent judge casting its gaze over the tableau, a disheveled man, a poised woman, and the unspoken story hanging heavy between them. Maya took a slow, deliberate step backward, her hands raised just enough to signal compliance, her breathing measured despite the weight pressing against her chest. She'd faced worse years spent navigating high-stakes operations, where a single wrong move could mean the end, where the line between life and death was as thin as a razor's edge. But here, in the heart of this sleepy neighborhood, the danger felt different, more insidious. It wasn't the threat of bullets or bombs, it was the threat of perception. The way a scene like this could be spun into a noose around her neck. To the untrained eye, she knew how it looked. Todd, a white officer, flushed with rage and disarray, his uniform wrinkled and his pride bruised, and her, a black woman, standing tall, unshaken, her calm almost defiant in its steadiness. Too calm, perhaps, for those who didn't understand the discipline it took to hold herself together under scrutiny. Across from her, Todd straightened, pulling himself up with exaggerated effort, his chest rising and falling like he'd just clawed his way out of a battlefield. His gaze darted to the nearest squad car, locking onto the figure emerging from it, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his uniform pristine, the silver badge glinting under the streetlights like a beacon of authority. Lieutenant Daniel Harris moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect, his steps precise, his presence deliberate. But Maya saw more than the polished exterior. She saw the faint lines etched into his face, the subtle tension in his jaw that hinted at a man who'd seen too much to take anything at face value. Experience didn't guarantee impartiality, and that was the gamble she faced now. Would he see her truth, or would Todd's venomous words poison the air first? Harris's sharp eyes swept the scene, taking it all in with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. The baton lying abandoned on the pavement, its black surface scuffed from the struggle. Todd's fists still clenched tight as if ready to swing, and Maya, standing firm, her posture a silent testament to her resolve. Then his gaze settled on Todd, who wasted no time seizing the moment. "She attacked me," he spat, his voice tight with a barely contained eagerness, like a man desperate to claw back control. Maya let out a slow breath through her nose, the sound almost imperceptible, but inside. Her mind raced. There at waist lie she'd known was coming. She resisted when I tried to question her. Todd pressed on, his tone shifting, smooth as oil, into the cadence of a wronged officer. Got aggressive, put her hands on me, took me down. You called for backup saying she was resisting arrest. Harris's head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. A mask carved from years of diffusing chaos. Was she under arrest? He asked, his voice flat, cutting through Todd's momentum like a dull blade. Todd faltered, just for a heartbeat, a flicker of hesitation so brief most wouldn't catch it. But Maya did. I was conducting a stop, he said, his words slower now, chosen with care to mold the story into something defensible. She refused to comply. She got physical first. I had to defend myself. Maya didn't flinch, didn't speak. She knew better than to leap into the fray. Knew that Todd's narrative was already taking root like weeds in cracked pavement. If she let him dominate the conversation, she'd be buried beneath his version of events. She had to shift the tide, but not with words, not yet. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward her jacket pocket. The air tightened around her as the officers nearby tensed, their hands drifting toward holsters, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. She kept her movement steady, unhurried, and then, with a single fluid motion, she drew out a slim leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a Badgia CIA badge. The effect was instantaneous, like a thunderclap in a silent room. Todd's mouth snapped shut, his righteous fury curdling into something colder, more brittle. The other officers shifted on their feet, exchanging quick, uneasy glances, their certainty unraveling. Even Harris, stoic as he was, betrayed a fleeting glimmer of surprise before his face settled back into its composed neutrality. Maya met his gaze, her voice steady as steel. "I am Special Agent Maya Turner," she said, each word ringing with quiet authority. "United States Central Intelligence Agency." Silence stretched taut across the street, broken only by the faint crackle of radios from the squad cars. Todd took a half step forward, his face a war zone of disbelief and rage. "That's," he started, but Maya didn't even glance at him. She extended her credentials toward Harris, who took them without hesitation, his fingers brushing the leather as he studied the badge. He tilted it under the streetlight, his eyes flicking between the embossed emblem and the identification card nestled beside it, verifying every detail with the meticulousness of a man who'd learned to trust nothing. At first glance, Maya stood still, letting him absorb the gravity of what he held a federal agent's authority, a truth that dismantled Todd's flimsy tale with surgical precision. Harris exhaled sharply through his nose, snapping the wallet shut and handing it back to her. "Agent Turner," he said, his tone measured but carrying a new weight. "Can you explain what happened here?" Todd bristled, his voice rising like a cornered animal's growl. "What? You're taking her side now." Harris ignored him, his focus locked on Maya. She seized the opening. "I was taking a walk," she said, her words simple but deliberate. Cutting through the noise, Officer Reynolds followed me in his patrol car, initiated a stop without cause, and demanded to search my bag. When I refused, he escalated to physical force. I acted in self-defense to neutralize the threat. "Threat?" Todd barked, his voice dripping with scorn. "You're making it sound like I enough." Harris snapped, his tone a whipcrack that silenced Todd mid-sentence. Todd's jaw clenched, but he held his tongue. Harris turned back to Maya, his eyes searching her face. "Did you sustain any injuries?" "No." "Did he strike you?" "He attempted to." "Did you strike him?" "I restrained him." Todd let out a bitter, jagged laugh, the sound grating against the night. "Yeah, you restrained me all right." Slammed me into the ground like some goddamn. Harris shot him a look, sharp and unyielding, and Todd's mouth clamped shut again, his resentment simmering just beneath the surface. A long pause followed, the air thick with unspoken questions. Then Harris sighed, glancing toward the officers hovering by the cruisers. "Reynolds, you're coming with us." Todd stiffened, his body going rigid as if he'd been struck. "Excuse me?" "We're going back to the station," Harris said, his voice leaving no room for debate. We need a full report and a statement. Todd's voice climbed higher, laced with disbelief and something sharper, more dangerous. You're seriously treating me like a suspect right now. I was the one who called this in. She's the one who I heard your call, Harris interrupted, his tone cold and final. And I heard hers. Todd's face paled, the color draining from his cheeks as realization sank in. Maya had made a call minutes before his own, not for backup, but to report misconduct. That call was now logged, a permanent mark in the dispatch records, a thread of evidence he couldn't unravel. His jaw tightened until the veins in his neck bulged, and for the first time that night, Maya saw something new flicker in his eyes, fear. Not just anger, not just frustration, but the raw, visceral dread of a man who'd overplayed his hand and now faced the reckoning. Harris turned back to Maya, his expression softening just enough to hint at respect. Agent Turner, I'm going to need you to come down to the station as well. Just to finalize your statement. She gave a small nod, her voice steady. Understood. Todd remained rooted in place, his fingers twitching at his sides, his entire frame vibrating with a rage he could barely contain. You have no idea what you're doing, he hissed at Harris, the words dripping with venom. Harris didn't even acknowledge him, simply gesturing to one of the waiting officers. Take him in. As Todd was led away, his steps stiff and reluctant, Maya watched in silence, her mind already turning to what came next. The interrogation room at the Rosewood Police Department awaited her, its gray walls and harsh lighting a familiar stage for the debriefings she'd endured countless times before. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield or a covert operation gone. Arthas was home, and yet the stakes felt just as high. Across from her, Harris would sit, his hands folded atop a thin manila folder, his sharp eyes probing for truth amid the tangle of lies. He'd be cautious, professional, but beneath it all, she'd sense his warness, a man who knew the system's flaws too well to trust it blindly. For Todd, this was no longer a simple power play gone wrong. It was a mirror held up to his actions, reflecting the ugly truth of his abuse of authority. Justice, Maya thought, wasn't always swift or loud. It was patient, methodical, a slow grind that crushed those who thought themselves untouchable. And as the cruiser's taillights faded into the night, she felt the weight of that lesson settle into her bones. Power unchecked was a blade that cut both ways, and tonight, Todd had learned just how deep it could wound. The air in the cramped interrogation room hung heavy, thick with the weight of what had transpired earlier that night. Officer Harris sat across from Maya Turner, his posture rigid yet steady, exuding the calm authority of someone who had navigated countless tense situations. You understand why we have to stick to protocol, he said, his voice even, betraying no hint of impatience. His dark eyes met hers, searching for acknowledgement. We need an official statement. Maya gave a slow nod, her expression composed, though beneath the surface, her mind churned with a quiet storm of emotion, anger, resolve, and a faint flicker of exhaustion. Of course, she replied softly, her tone measured, masking the intensity brewing within her. Harris slid a yellow legal pad across the scratched wooden table, its surface worn from years of confessions and denials. The faint squeak of the paper against the wood broke the silence. As Maya reached for the pen he offered, her fingers closed around it with a practiced ease, the cool metal grounding her as she prepared to lay bare the night's chaos. She began to write, her hand gliding across the page with a fluid grace that belied the gravity of her words. Each sentence unfurled with precision, her recollection of the events sharp and unyielding. She described the moment Todd Reynolds had approached her unprovoked, his voice dripping with unwarranted authority, his stance radiating hostility. She detailed how his hand had shot out, grabbing her arm with a force that left faint bruises blooming beneath her skin. How his words had escalated into threats when she refused to cower. Her handwriting was deliberate, every loop and curve a testament to her determination to leave no room for doubt. She'd given verbal accounts before, countless times in her career with the CIA. But this was different. A written statement carried a permanence, a weight that could not be twisted or dismissed. There would be no cracks for someone like Reynolds to slip through, no shadows for him to hide in. When she finished, she pushed the pad back toward Harris, the soft scrape of paper against wood punctuating the silence. He picked it up, his brow furrowing slightly as his eyes scanned her words. "You're saying Reynolds initiated contact without cause?" he asked, his voice low, probing. "Yes," Maya replied, her gaze steady, unflinching. "And that he escalated to physical force first?" "Yes." Her answer was a quiet thunderclap, reverberating with certainty. Harris let out a slow, heavy exhale, setting the pad down with a thud that echoed faintly in the room. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the manila folder. In front of him stood Reynolds' personnel file. Maya's eyes flicked to it for a fleeting moment, a spark of curiosity igniting within her. She didn't need to ask what lay inside. She could already guess. Years of instinct and experience told her it was a Pandora's box of buried sins. Harris studied her, his gaze piercing yet tinged with something soft respect, perhaps, or recognition of the power she wielded. Then, with a deliberate motion, he flipped the folder open. "Do you want to know the real reason Reynolds never made detective?" His question hung in the air, thick with implication. Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough, a quiet demand for the truth. Harris turned a few pages, his expression tightening as he traced the lines of documented misdeeds. "He has a history," he said, his voice hardening. "Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, unnecessary stops, nothing that ever stuck, mind you, but enough to make you wonder." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. She had suspected as much. She'd seen the pattern before, reports filed, voices raised, only to be smothered by a system that protected its own. "They always got buried," Harris continued, his tone laced with frustration. "Officers backing up officers, witnesses too scared to speak, the usual." He paused, meeting her eyes again. But now he let the words trail off, a slow breath escaping him. Now he picked the wrong person to mess with. The statement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of meaning spreading outward. Maya felt its weight settle deep within her, not just because of the night's events, but because of who she was. She wasn't just another civilian, another name on a report. She was a CIA agent, a woman with power etched into her very being. And with that power came the promise of accountability. For once, Todd Reynolds wouldn't be able to bury his mistakes beneath a shield of blue loyalty. Not this time. Across town, in a sleek law office bathed in the warm, amber glow of a desk lamp, Todd Reynolds sat hunched in a leather chair, his broad frame coiled with barely contained rage. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the bitterness radiating from him. His attorney, Peter Calloway, sat opposite, a polished man in his 50s with silver hair and a practiced air of detachment. Calloway adjusted his silk tie, the faint rustle of fabric cutting through Todd's seething silence. "This is bullshit," Todd spat, his voice tight, raw with frustration, each syllable trembling with the fury he could no longer suppress. Calloway leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers with the calm precision of a man who had weathered many storms. "It's a serious accusation," he replied smoothly, his tone unruffled. Todd scoffed, the sound sharp and bitter. "It's a lie." Calloway's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained composed. "A lie backed by a CIA agent." Todd's fingers curled into fists, the knuckles whitening as he gripped the arms of the chair. "That doesn't mean she's untouchable," he snarled, his voice low, venomous. Calloway exhaled through his nose, a faint sound of exasperation, and flipped through the stack of documents on his desk. Legal forms, witness statements, a ticking clock of consequences. "You have options," he said, his voice steady, calculated. "Right now, Internal Affairs is conducting their review. That gives us a window to counter. We could file a claim against Turner." Todd's mouth twisted into a sneer. "For what?" Calloway's response came effortlessly, as if he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. "Assaulting an officer, interfering with a lawful investigation. If we frame the narrative correct, like it as though you were trying to de-escalate, and she turned violent, we might have something." Todd leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a dangerous hunger. "I want her gone," he said, each word dripping with malice. Calloway regarded him carefully, his fingers pausing mid-tap against the desk. "That's a tall order." "I don't care," Todd growled, his voice rising, a raw edge cutting through the polished calm of the room. "She humiliated me, made me look weak in front of everyone." His chest heaved as he spoke. The memory of that night burning behind his eyes, Maya standing there, unshaken, her quiet strength stripping him bare before his peers. Calloway tapped his pen against the desk, a rhythmic tick that mirrored the tension in the air. If we push too hard and this backfires, you could lose everything, your pension, your reputation, any chance of salvaging this. Todd's eyes blazed, twin embers of defiance. Then make sure it doesn't backfire. Over the next few days, the investigation gained momentum, a relentless tide pulling Todd deeper into its undertow. Interviews unfolded in sterile rooms, voices hushed but urgent, reports piled up on desks, their pages heavy with damning details. Bodycam footage flickered across screens, grainy images capturing the moment Reynolds crossed the line, his hand on Maya's arm, his voice barking orders she had no obligation to obey. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. Harris had been right. Todd's record was a graveyard of missteps and substantive complaints. From trembling civilians, allegations of excessive force brushed aside. A pattern of abuse cloaked in silence. Now, that silence was breaking, and the weight of it all pressed down on him like a collapsing sky. Maya was summoned for a follow-up interview, stepping into the precinct with the same quiet resolve she'd carried that first night. This time, the questions weren't about her actions, they were about Todd, the investigator. A weary man with tired eyes named Daniels leaned forward in his chair, his notepad open. Did he say anything that indicated bias? Yes, Maya answered, her voice clear, unwavering. She could still hear Todd's words ringing in her ears, the sneer in his tone when he'd demanded to know who she thought she was. Did he attempt to coerce or intimidate you? Yes, she remembered the way he'd loomed over her, his bulk a silent threat, his grip tightening as he tried to bend her to his will. Do you believe this was a personal targeting rather than a lawful stop? Maya met Daniel's gaze, her dark eyes steady as steel. Yes, each response was a hammer strike, driving nails into the coffin of Todd's career. She knew it, felt it in the marrow of her bones. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness who'd finally found their courage. Footage that couldn't be denied, a history that refused to stay buried. Yet Todd wasn't done fighting. 2 days after his formal suspension, a legal notice arrived at Maya's doorstep, delivered by a nervous courier who avoided her gaze. She stood in her living room, the paper trembling slightly in her hands as she read the words. Todd Reynolds was suing her. Wrongful accusation, defamation, career sabotage. The claims were absurd, a desperate flailing of a drowning man. But they carried a menace she couldn't ignore. Desperation made men unpredictable, dangerous. Her phone buzzed on the counter, cutting through her thoughts. She picked it up, her handler's voice crackling through the line. We've been monitoring the situation, the handler said, his tone clipped, professional. Reynolds isn't letting this go. Maya's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath her skin. I figured. He's making noise with the right people, the handler continued. Certain law enforcement groups, media outlets. He's trying to turn this into a battle of public perception. Maya closed her eyes, a wave of weariness washing over her. Todd wasn't seeking justice, he wanted revenge, and he'd burn the world down to get it. Her handler's voice dropped lower, a warning woven into his words. Be careful, Turner. Men like him don't go down quietly. She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the phone. I know. The official notice of Todd's indefinite suspension came swiftly, a guillotine blade slicing through his career. No badge, no gun. No patrol car, just a hollow shell of the man he'd been. The department tried to keep it quiet, but in a town like Rosewood, secrets traveled on the wind. Whispers spread through diner booths and bar stools, a quiet hum of judgment. His fellow officersmen who'd once slapped his back, laughed at his crude jokes, turned a blind eye to his excessive snow, avoided him like a plague. They shuffled past him in the precinct parking lot, their eyes averted, their footsteps quick. That betrayal stung, a sharp twist of the knife, but it paled beside the humiliation of knowing Maya Turner had orchestrated his fall. Every time Todd closed his eyes, he saw her calm, unshaken. Her presence a silent rebuke that stripped him of everything he'd built. The memory festered, a wound that refused to heal. It started small, a late-night drive past her house, the engine idling just long enough to draw a breath before he moved on. A stop outside the cafe she frequented, watching from across the street as she sipped her coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing in his chest. A slow cruise by the grocery store, noting the bags she carried, the way she moved with quiet purpose. He told himself it wasn't stalking, wasn't doing anything wrong. He just needed to understand her, to unravel the mystery of how a nobody like her had dismantled his life. Then, one evening, he parked outside her house and waited. The street was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, the air cool and still. Inside her home, Maya felt the shift before she saw it prickling at the back of her neck, the instinct of a predator sensing a hunter. She'd ignored it at first, the occasional car lingering too long, the weight of unseen eyes brushing against her, but now it was undeniable. Stepping to the window, she peered through the blinds and saw it, a dark sedan, parked just far enough to avoid suspicion, but not far enough to escape her notice. No headlights, no movement, just a shadow waiting. Her mind raced, calculating her options. Call the police, pointless. By the time a patrol car arrived, he'd be gone, and even if they caught him, what could they do? He wasn't breaking any laws yet. Confront him, risky, but she'd faced worse than Todd Reynolds. She'd stared down warlords and spies. She wouldn't flinch now. Stepping outside, the night air wrapped around her, crisp and biting, but she barely felt it. Her focus was singular, her steps deliberate as she approached the car. Todd sat in the driver's seat, his fingers drumming a restless beat against the steering wheel. Shadows cloaked his face, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his grip tightened as she drew near. She stopped a few feet away, hands at her sides open, non-threatening, yet radiating a quiet strength, their eyes locked through the windshield, the air between them crackling with unspoken hostility. Slowly, Todd rolled down the window, the hum of the mechanism slicing through the silence. Maya spoke first, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You really think this is a good idea?" Todd smirked, that same cocky grin he'd worn the night he'd tried to break her. But beneath it, she saw something else, a fear, desperation, the unraveling of a man who'd lost control. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, forged its own chains. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, and Todd Reynolds was learning its weight the hard way. The night air hung heavy as Maya Turner stood on the cracked pavement of a quiet Rosewood street, her breath fogging faintly in the cool March chill. She hadn't expected to see him here, not tonight, not like this. Todd Reynolds leaned casually against his car, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth as if he still held all the cards. The sodium glow of a street lamp bathed him in an unflattering light, revealing the mess he'd become, wrinkled shirt hanging loose, stubble creeping past a mere 5 o'clock shadow into something wild and neglected, and a glint in his eyes that flickered between desperation and madness. He looked like a man teetering on the edge, and that made him more dangerous than ever. "Nice night, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with a forced ease that grated against her nerves. "Didn't think I'd need your permission to enjoy it." Maya's exhale came sharp through her nose, a quiet huff of disdain as she tilted her head, studying him like a predator sizing up prey. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch, her dark eyes piercing through the bravado he wore like a tattered cloak. Inside, her mind churned. It wasn't here by chance, and they both knew it. "You're not here by accident," he pressed, his smirk widening as if he'd caught her in some grand trap. His voice carried a taunting lilt, but beneath it, she heard the strain, the cracks in his confidence. "You don't know that," she replied coolly, her words measured, her gaze unwavering. She saw it now, clearer than ever, was unraveling, the Todd she'd once known. The one who strutted through the precinct with a badge and an ego was gone. In his place stood a man clinging to the remnants of power, his desperation seeping through every twitch of his face. "You lost," she said, her voice cutting through the night like a blade, simple and final. Todd's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, a flicker of doubt flashing across his features before he buried it under a scowl. "This isn't over," he muttered, his fingers flexing against the steering wheel as if itching to reclaim control. "It is," Maya countered, stepping closer, her presence steady and unyielding. "You just don't see it yet." Her words hung heavy, a quiet promise laced with steel. Inside, she felt a storm brewing, anger at his arrogance, pity for his fall, and a cold certainty that this wouldn't end cleanly. Todd's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned toward her, venom dripping from his next words. "You think flashing a badge makes you untouchable?" His voice was low, a growl that carried years of resentment. Maya didn't flinch. She took another deliberate step forward, her boots scuffing softly against the asphalt, and her voice dropped to a whisper, soft yet lethal. "No. I think you're too blind to see you've already torched your own life." For a split second, his mask slippage flared in his eyes, but beneath it, she glimpsed something raw, something broken. Then it was gone, swallowed by the fury that had always defined him. "I'm not the one who should be worried," he spat, leaning in closer, his lips curling into a sneer that twisted his face into something grotesque. "You don't belong here, Turner. People like you." He let the sentence dangle, unfinished, but the weight of it slammed into her anyway. "People like you." Her jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath her skin as memories of every slight, every whispered insult from men like him flooded back. She'd heard it all before, and it still stung, not because it was true, but because he believed it gave him power. Maya held his gaze, unflinching. "You already ruined yourself," she said, her voice steady as stone, cutting deeper than any shout could. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, the only sound the faint hum of the car's engine idling nearby. Todd's chest heaved, his breaths ragged, his mind clearly racing for a comeback, a way to reclaim the upper hand, but there was nothing left to say. Without another word, he yanked the car door open, slid inside, and rolled up the window with a sharp flick of his wrist. The engine roared as he peeled away, tires squealing against the pavement, disappearing into the night like a wounded animal retreating to lick its wounds. But Maya knew better. Wounded animals didn't slink off quietly. They came back, teeth bared, driven by spite. The official reckoning arrived on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the sky seemed to press down on Rosewood with a quiet, judgmental weight. Todd Reynolds sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the termination notice clutched in his trembling hands. The words were cold, clinical, typed in crisp black ink on Rosewood Police Department letterhead, effective immediately. "Todd Reynolds is terminated." A single paragraph, devoid of emotion, but to him, it was a guillotine blade slicing through a decade of his life. Internal affairs had finished their work, and the evidence was a noose tightening around his neck. Bodycam footage that didn't match his lies, dispatch logs exposing his contradictions, and a stack of ignored complaints that painted a picture of a man drunk on power. For years, he'd dodged consequences, shielded by colleagues who turned a blind eye. Now, that shield was gone. No badge, no pension, nothing. His chest burned with a fire that felt like it could consume him, while ice slithered through his veins, numbing his fingertips as they crumpled the paper. This was her fault, Maya Turner's fault. She'd stood there on that street, calm and untouchable, and somehow turned his world to ash. The thought gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin, as he stormed out of his apartment and into the precinct, his boots pounding the sidewalk with every furious step. The lobby was a tomb when he arrived. Officers who once clapped him on the back now averted their eyes, their murmurs dying as he passed. Secretaries shuffled papers with sudden urgency, their glances darting anywhere but at him. The news had spread like wildfire. Did Reynolds, the disgraced cop, and the weight of their silent judgment pressed against his ribs. He didn't care. He shoved through the glass doors and marched straight to Captain James Holloway's office, his pulse hammering in his ears as he flung the door open without a knock. Holloway sat behind his desk, a grizzled man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face carved from years of hard choices. He barely glanced up from his paperwork, unfazed by the intrusion. "Reynolds," he said flatly, setting his pen down with deliberate calm. Todd slammed the termination notice onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. "This is bullshit," he snarled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Holloway leaned back in his chair, his steady gaze locking onto Todd's wild one. "It's final," he said, his tone even, unyielding. Todd's fists clenched, knuckles whitening as he loomed over the desk. "You're really going to let this happen?" His words were a plea masked as a challenge. But Holloway didn't blink. "You dug this hole yourself," the captain replied. his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many like Todd come and go. 10 years, and you've got more complaints than anyone on this force. We covered for you more than we should have. But this, he tapped the notice with a calloused finger. This isn't something we can bury. She didn't do anything but defend herself. Holloway cut in before Todd could argue, his voice sharpening. And don't even try it, there's video. Todd froze, his breath catching as his mind reeled. Video, that couldn't be right. He'd disabled his body cam that night, certain he'd covered his tracks. He'd always been carefuler, so he thought. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line, reading the confusion on Todd's face like an open book. You think we only pulled your footage? He asked, a faint edge of disbelief in his tone. It's 2025, Reynolds. Traffic cams, doorbell cams, even a damn rideshare dashcam caught you. You're done. The room seemed to shrink, walls closing in as Todd's last shred of control slipped away. He'd built his life on bending the narrative, twisting the truth until it fit his story. Now, the world had turned its unblinking eye on him, and there was nowhere left to hide. He stumbled out of the precinct that day, a hollow shell of the man he'd been, the echoes of his own footsteps mocking him as he went. The week that followed was a blur of desperation. Todd filed appeals, each one stamped denied with cold efficiency. He called every lawyer he knew, his voice hoarse with threats of lawsuits. But no firm would touch him. His name was poison now. He even tried the media, spinning a tale of victimhood, claiming he'd been scapegoated by a system too afraid to stand up to political correctness. The reporters barely listened, and Rosewood's residents didn't care. This wasn't a town that clung to scandals. They craved quiet, normalcy, and Todd Reynolds was a stain they wanted scrubbed clean. Even his old buddies, the ones who'd shared beers and laughed at his crude jokes, now treated him like a stranger, their eyes sliding past him in the grocery store or at the gas station. And the worst part, Maya Turner hadn't said a word. Not a single press conference, not a smug interview, nothing. She'd walked away from that night like it was nothing, like he was nothing. While his life crumbled into dust, it ate at him, a festering wound that refused to heal. She'd won without even trying, and that made his blood boil. She should have been afraid. She should have known this wasn't over, because he wasn't donning it by a long shot. For Maya, the department's decision should have been a relief. Todd was out, his badge stripped away, his power reduced to a memory. For the first time since that night on the street, she didn't have to glance over her shoulder, wondering if he'd be there, hiding behind authority to settle his score. Justice had been served, a rare victory in a world that often looked the other way. But as she stood in her small living room, the curtains drawn tight against the night, a nagging unease coiled in her gut. Her instinct in war zones, sharpened by years of survival, whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. Men like Todd didn't fade quietly into the shadows. When they lost everything, they lashed out, and she'd seen it too many times to pretend otherwise. She was no stranger to silence. It had been her companion in foreign deserts, where every rustle could mean death, in safe houses where sleep came shallow and wary. But this silence was different, as still, to heavy. The suburban street outside her window was a void, absent the usual hum of life. No distant engines, no barking dogs, no muffled sitcom laughter seeping through thin walls. Her senses screamed that something was wrong, that the quiet wasn't peace, it was a predator holding its breath. She'd known Todd wouldn't let go. She'd seen it in his eyes that night, the manic gleam of a man who'd rather burn the world than admit defeat. And now, weeks later, as she stood in the dim glow of a single lamp, her instincts roared to life. She wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, beyond the glass, he was waiting. Todd had spent those weeks rotting in his own rage. The lawsuits had collapsed. His name was a punchline, and the precinct had erased him like a bad dream, all because of her. Maya Turner had taken everything: his career, his pride, his future, and left him with nothing but the bitter taste of failure. If the system wouldn't give him justice, he'd carve it out himself. She'd ruined him, so he'd ruin her. The plan was crude but effective. Watch her, learn her, strike when she least expected it. He'd staked out her house for days, hunched in his car with a thermos of cheap coffee, mapping her routines. She was careful, always scanning her surroundings, but she wasn't invincible. No one was. Tonight was the night. He crept through the shadows of her backyard, his breath shallow, his heart pounding with a mix of fury and anticipation. The weight of the gun in his hand felt right, a cold comfort as he approached the back window. He didn't hesitate as fist smashed through the glass, shards raining onto the hardwood floor inside. He climbed through, boots crunching debris, his pulse racing as he stepped into her domain. Maya had heard the creak of the floorboards moments before, her hand already closing around the pistol stashed under her coffee table. She'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but deep down, she'd known it would. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the glass shattered, her body moving on instinct before her mind fully caught up. She spun toward the sound, dropping low as a shadow filled the hallway, gun raised. His face twisted with hate. He fired first, the shot deafening in the small space, the bullet tearing into the wall behind her as she dove behind the couch. Plaster dust clouded the air, stinging her eyes as she steadied her breathing. "Come on out, Turner." His voice was a jagged snarl, echoing through the house. "Let's finish this." She didn't answer, sliding silently along the floor to a better angle, her training kicking in. "This is the dumbest thing you've ever done, Reynolds," she called back, her tone icy despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. He laughed, a broken, unhinged sound that sent a chill down her spine. "And yet here I am, about to end this." Another shot rang out, the lamp beside her exploding into fragments, plunging the room into deeper shadow. She weighed her options, her mind racing. One clean shot sent her mass and it'd be over. She could do it. She'd done it before, in places far worse than this. But something stopped her, not fear, not mercy, but a realization. Todd wanted this. He wanted her to pull the trigger, to give him the out he couldn't take himself. She saw it in the wildness of his eyes, the tremble in his hand. He wasn't just here to kill her. He was here to die, to drag her down with him into the abyss he'd built. The lesson hit her then, sharp and clear. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about consequences, about letting men like Todd reap what they'd sown. He'd abused his power, wielded it like a weapon, and now it had turned on him, stripping him bare. She wouldn't give him the easy way out, not tonight. As the standoff stretched on, the air thick with tension, Maya gripped her weapon tighter, ready to fight not for vengeance, but for survival, and for the deeper truth that power, unchecked, always devours itself in the end. The wildness in Todd Reynolds' voice tore through the stillness of the room like a jagged blade, raw and untamed, a sound that carried no trace of reason. His attack was reckless, a chaotic storm of fury unleashed not for escape or victory, but for something darker, a desperate need to pull Maya Turner into the abyss with him. Every muscle in his body screamed with that intent as he lunged, his eyes blazing with a manic fire. But Maya wasn't about to let him have that twisted triumph. She refused to be the prey he craved, the broken trophy of his unraveling pride. Her instincts kicked in, sharp and honed from years of survival, and she moved with a speed that matched the pounding of her own heart. The living room was a battlefield now, shadows stretching across the hardwood floor as the dim glow of a single lamp flickered in the corner. Maya's gaze darted to the coffee table, where a heavy glass tumbler sat, its edges catching the faint light. Without hesitation, she snatched it, her fingers curling tight around its cool surface, and hurled it toward the hallway with all her strength. It sailed through the air, a fleeting missile, before exploding against the wall in a deafening crash of splintered glass. The sound reverberated, sharp and jarring, and Todd flinched at his head, snapping toward the noise, his focus breaking for just a heartbeat. That was all she needed. Maya sprang to her feet, her breath shallow but steady, closing the gap between them before he could recover. Her hand shot out, swift and precise, clamping onto his wrist with a grip like iron. The gun in his hand trembled as she twisted, her muscles straining against his resistance. He squeezed the trigger in a blind rage, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap, but her force had already sent the bullet off course. It punched into the ceiling above, showering them with a fine dusting of plaster. Todd roared, a guttural sound of frustration and pain, shoving against her with the desperation of a cornered beast. But Maya was already ahead of him, her mind a step beyond his chaos. She drove her knee hard into his ribs, feeling the jolt of impact ripple through her leg as he grunted, his breath catching in a ragged wheeze. His hold on the gun weakened, just enough, as she struck again, an elbow slicing through the air, connecting with his jaw in a brutal crack. The weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, but Todd wasn't finished yet. He swung at her wildly, his fist catching her shoulder with a force that sent a white-hot flare of pain searing through her nerves. She stumbled slightly, the ache blooming deep in her muscle, but she swallowed it down, letting his momentum fuel her counter. With a quick pivot, she swept his leg out from under him, her movements fluid despite the throbbing in her arm. Todd crashed to the ground, the air exploding from his lungs in a violent gasp as his body hit the hardwood with a thud that echoed through the house. Maya didn't pause to savor the moment. She dropped onto him, pinning him beneath her weight, her knee pressing into his spine as she wrenched his arm behind his back in a hold so tight it made her own hands ache. He thrashed beneath her, snarling like a wounded animal caught in a trap, his voice hoarse and feral as he spat, "Get the hell off me." But Maya only tightened her grip, her resolve unyielding. "This is over, Reynolds," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through his growls like a blade through smoke. His breathing came in furious, uneven bursts, his chest heaving against the floor. "Not yet," he hissed, defiance still burning in his tone even as his strength ebbed. Then, piercing the tension, came the wail of siren, sharp, insistent, and growing louder by the second. For the first time since he'd smashed through her front door, Todd went still. Maya felt it ripple through him, a subtle shift beneath her hands, fear. It flickered in the way his muscles tensed, in the sudden hitch of his breath. The chaos of his rage had masked it before, but now it was undeniable. The front door burst open with a crash, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the floorboards filling the room. "Drop your weapon," an officer barked, his voice booming with authority. Maya raised one hand slowly, palm open, signaling peace while keeping Todd locked beneath her. He let out a strangled grunt, a mix of fury and helplessness, as the reality closed in around him. Through the haze of adrenaline, a familiar voice cut through Harris, her old partner, steady and calm amidst the storm. "Turner, you good?" he called, his tone laced with concern but tempered by trust in her resilience. "Yeah," Maya exhaled, the word carrying the weight of everything she'd just endured. "He's done." Harris stepped closer, his silhouette framed by the flashing red and blue lights spilling in from outside. He gave a curt nod to the other officers, who moved in with practiced efficiency. Two of them hauled Todd to his feet, yanking his arms behind his back with a roughness that matched his earlier violence. He thrashed once, a final futile burst of resistance, but there was no fight left in him. His breathing was labored, his face contorted with a mix of rage and something nude feet. Maya rose slowly, rolling her shoulder to ease the lingering sting, and watched as they dragged him toward the door. Just before they shoved him outside, Todd twisted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto hers. Even now, after all he'd lost, a smirk curled his lips, thin and bitter. "This ain't over, Turner," he rasped. Her expression remained stone cold, unflinching. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice a quiet promise. The arrest was only the beginning. Todd Reynolds faced the full weight of the law, charged with breaking and entering, attempted assault with a deadly weapon, and unlawful use of a firearm, crimes that painted a vivid picture of the man he'd become. The evidence was a mountain he couldn't climb, grainy surveillance footage from neighbors' cameras, showing him skulking around Maya's house for weeks, his shadow a persistent ghost in the night, ballistics tying the bullets lodged in her walls to his service pistol, a weapon he'd once carried with pride, and his own voice, unhinged and venomous, captured in jail calls where he ranted without a shred of remorse. The trial unfolded swiftly, a whirlwind of testimony and cold facts that left no room for doubt. Maya sat in the courtroom, her posture rigid but calm, her face a mask as the judge's voice rang out with the verdict, guilty. The sentence followed: 15 years, no parole for the first 10. It wasn't the lifetime behind bars some might have wanted for a man like him, but it was enough. Enough to strip him bare, to end the life he'd known. Todd didn't react as the gavel fell. No shouts, no pleas, just silence heavy and seething. He sat there, a man who'd never imagined this moment, a man who'd believed his badge, his power, made him untouchable. Men like him, who saw authority as their birthright and defiance as an insult to be crushed, didn't change, they festered. And yet, here he was, losing everything: his freedom, his name, his delusion of invincibility. The lesson was stark. Justice, when it came, could be a slow blade, but it cut deep. For Todd, it severed the roots of the life he'd built on arrogance and abuse. For Maya, it was a reminder of how fragile that justice could be, how close she'd come to a different ending. The story didn't fade quietly. Headlines erupted, first in Rosewood, then rippling across the country. Former officer sentenced in attempted murder of CIA agent. The articles dug into his past history of brutality cloaked by a system that had shielded him for too long. Maya's name became a reluctant beacon, a symbol of resistance against a tide of corruption. Reporters hounded her, their calls buzzing like flies she swatted away. Activists begged her to lead their charge, to stand as a figurehead for reform. But Maya wanted none of it. She'd spent her life in the shadows missions in forgotten corners of the world. Her name erased from the records of her victories. Fame wasn't her currency. Instead, she turned inward, staying in Rosewood not out of duty, but because fleeing wasn't her way. She patched the broken window, its jagged edges a memory of that night, and replaced the drywall scarred by his bullets. Each repair was a quiet act of reclamation, a refusal to let him define her space or her soul. The cost lingered, though. Victory hadn't come cheap. She'd felt the system's gears grind close to failure, seen how easily they could have turned against her. That truth gnawed at her, a shadow she couldn't outrun. One evening, weeks after the trial, she sat on her porch, the air cool and tinged with the scent of fading summer. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. For the first time in months, the street felt still. No creeping cars, no unseen eyes, no waiting for the next blow. Todd was gone, locked away, his threat reduced to a whisper behind bars. But the system that had birthed him, that had nurtured his sickness, still stood. Maya sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her as the weight of that reality settled in her chest. Men like Todd weren't rare. They wore different faces, hid behind different title scops, bureaucrats, bosses, but their hunger for control was the same. She wasn't foolish enough to think this was the end. Another would come, someday, and when they did, she'd be ready. She always was. Time passed, and the seasons shifted. The day Maya left Rosewood, autumn had just begun to crisp the air. The leaves tinged with gold under a sky so clear it seemed to mock the turmoil she'd endured. She stood by her car, her hands resting lightly on the door, her eyes tracing the quiet streets one last time. The neighborhood was silent, save for the rustle of wind through the trees, a deceptive peace that didn't fool her. She'd come here seeking respite, a pause from the weight of her past. But peace had never been her fate. Todd was gone, his name now a cautionary tale whispered in diners and barbershops. His power stripped away. Yet the scars remained, not just hers, but the town's, etched into the collective memory of those who'd watched in silence as he'd spiraled. Rosewood had been a blip, less than a year of her life, a place she'd tried to fade into. She'd walked its streets, nodded at its people, sipped coffee in its diner, but she'd never belonged. Maya wasn't built for stillness, for the small talk of neighbors or the rhythm of a quiet life. She was a fighter, a strategist, forged in shadows and steel. Rest wasn't her reward. So she packed light, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, a suitcase in the trunk, a handful of keepsakes she couldn't leave behind. The rest stayed, unneeded baggage for a woman who'd learned to travel unburdened. As she drove away, the town unfolded in her rearview mirror, familiar faces, unchanged routines. The coffee shop owner, grizzled and gray, gave her a slow nod, his usual indifference softened by a flicker of respect. The old woman at the bookstore, her hands trembling as she shelved paperbacks, offered a hesitant smile, her wariness replaced by recognition. A boy on the corner, kicking a soccer ball against a curb, glanced up his father's warnings about strangers forgotten in the wake of her story. These were small shifts, fragile threads of change in a place that had stood by, some too afraid to act, others too late to care. Todd's fall had stirred them, but the system that had propped him up still loomed unshaken. Maya knew there were more like him out there, waiting in the wings. She hadn't fixed the world, hadn't dismantled its floss, but she'd won this fight. And she carried that victory forward, a quiet fire in her bones, knowing justice wasn't a single strike. It was a war, fought one battle at a time. The highway unfurled before Maya Turner like an endless ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the vast emptiness of the American landscape. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of her weathered truck, knuckles whitening as the engine hummed beneath her. Years of relentless struggle had carved lines into her face, each one a silent testament to battles fought in forgotten corners of the world places most people back home couldn't even pin on a map. She'd toppled warlords who thrived on chaos, slipped through the shadows of treacherous networks, and brought down men who strutted through life believing their power made them invincible. Dust from those far-off lands still lingered in the creases of her boots, a gritty reminder of the enemies she'd faced. Yet, as the miles stretched on, a bitter realization gnawed at her. The most dangerous foes weren't the ones lurking in distant jungles or desert strongholds. They were here, cloaked in authority, hiding behind badges that gleamed with false righteousness. Taking down Todd Reynolds had been a victory, but it was a hollow one, steeped in regret not for what she'd done, but for how much it had cost to expose what should have been plain to everyone. Todd, with his smug grin and unearned swagger, had been a cog in a machine that churned out corruption, a system that shielded the guilty and crushed those who dared to challenge it. Maya's fight to bring him to justice had been grueling, a war of attrition that left her exhausted, her spirit bruised but unbowed. She could still feel the weight of the courtroom air, thick with tension, as she'd laid bare his crimes, abuse of power, coercion, lives ruined under the guise of law and order. The victory tasted like ash because it had taken years of her life, countless sleepless nights, and a toll on her soul just to prove what she'd known from the start. Evil didn't always wear a foreign face. Sometimes it stood behind a podium, swearing to protect and serve. Now, with Todd behind bars, Maya's mind churned with restless energy. Where would she go next? The question hung heavy in the cab of her truck, mingling with the faint scent of gasoline and the low rumble of the road. She didn't have a map pinned down, no glowing neon sign pointing her toward the next fight. But she knew it was out there someplace, desperate for someone like her, someone forged in the fire of hardship, who wouldn't flinch at the sight of injustice or shrink when the odds towered against her. Her whole life had been a dance with shadows, a relentless pursuit of monsters who thrived in the dark. Maybe now, she thought, it was time to drag them into the daylight, to fight where everyone could see the stakes. The highway stretched on, a blank canvas of possibility, promising new cities, new missions, new enemies waiting to test her resolve. She didn't put stock in fat, too whimsical, too fragile a concept for a woman like her, but purpose. That was her anchor. Purpose drove her forward, a steady flame flickering in her chest, fueled by the weight of every battle she'd endured, yet never letting it define her. That clash with Todd wasn't just about one rotten cop. It was a reckoning with a system that too often wrapped its arms around the wrong people, offering them sanctuary while it turned a blind eye to the cries of the wronged. Justice, Maya had learned, wasn't a trophy you hoisted once and called it a day. It was a brutal, unending campaign, demanding every ounce of courage she could muster, a resilience that refused to buckle under pressure, and a stubborn refusal to walk away even when the world begged her to stop. The lesson sank deep into her bones. Power, when wielded without accountability, rotted everything it touched. Todd's downfall was a crack in the wall, but the structure still stood, looming and oppressive. She carried that truth with her as she drove, a quiet vow to keep swinging until the whole damn thing came crashing down. Meanwhile, miles away in the manicured streets of Hillcrest, Cassandra Brooks navigated a different battlefield. Her black Audi Q8 purred through the upscale neighborhood, its sleek lines slicing through an enclave of wealth where old money slept behind iron gates and ivy-draped walls. The leather steering wheel was cool under her palms, but her grip tightened as a familiar unease crept up her spine. Hillcrest wasn't her home. Her modest apartment sat on the other side of the city, but her work as a civil rights lawyer brought her here often, to the doorsteps of clients who could afford her expertise. Despite her success, she never quite shook the feeling of being an outsider in this world of pristine lawns and whispered privilege. Every glance from a passerby felt like a silent question. What's she doing here? She'd built a career dismantling injustice, yet the weight of those stares pressed against her chest, a reminder that respect wasn't always a shield. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught the glint of a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. Her breath hitched, a sharp stab of dread piercing the calm she'd tried to maintain. The red and blue lights flared to life, slicing through the stillness of the afternoon, and her heart plummeted. Not again. The cruiser shadowed her for a few agonizing blocks, its presence a predator stalking prey. Before the siren's wail cut through the air, Cassandra's exhale was jagged as she eased her car to the curb, her mind already racing through the script she knew by heart. She'd been here before too many times, spelled over for no reason beyond the color of her skin and the audacity of her success. "Stay calm," she murmured to herself, her voice a lifeline in the rising tide of frustration. "You've got this." The window rolled down with a soft hum, and Officer Jake Harmon stepped out of his cruiser. His walk was a slow, deliberate strut, dripping with arrogance that made Cassandra's stomach twist. Sunglasses hid his eyes, but his rigid stance and the tilt of his head screamed judgment. He'd sized her up before he even reached the car. Her clothes, her car, her very existence in this neighborhood, and found her wanting. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her tone measured, a tightrope walk between courtesy and defiance. Harmon leaned down, his shadow spilling into the car as he scanned the interior. His gaze lingered on the plush leather seats, the polished dashboard, then settled on her face. A smirk ghosted across his lips, so faint she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "Afternoon, Mum," he drawled, the word laced with mockery. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this area?" Cassandra's jaw clenched, but she kept her composure, reaching for her license and registration with practiced ease. "I'm on my way to a client's house." "Is there a problem, officer?" He didn't answer, just leaned closer, his presence an intrusion she could feel in her bones. "This your car?" he asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. She paused, the question a spark to the anger smoldering inside her. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice steady but edged with steel. Harmon straightened, folding his arms, his face darkening as if her calm certainty insulted him. "Can I see your license and registration?" It wasn't a request anymore. His voice had hardened, suspicion coiling around every syllable. She handed over the documents, and he gave them a cursory glance before fixing her with a skeptical stare. "This a rental?" He pressed. "No," she said firmly. "It's mine." He stood there, towering over her open window, his silence a challenge, daring her to falter, to confess she didn't belong in this car, this neighborhood, this life. When she didn't, he shook his head, eyes narrowing behind those mirrored lenses. "Step out of the car, ma'am." Her breath caught. "Excuse me." He repeated it, slower, each word a hammer strike. "Step out of the car." Her pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "For what reason?" "I've done nothing wrong." His hand drifted toward the holster at his hip, a silent threat, and the air grew thick with tension. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll have to make you," he warned, his voice ice cold. Reluctantly, Cassandra unbuckled her seatbelt, the click echoing in the quiet car. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the sun-warmed sidewalk, humiliation crashing over her like a wave. Here she was, Cassandra Brooks, accomplished, respected, a force in the courtroom, reduced to a spectacle on a pristine street. Pedestrians slowed, their eyes darting between curiosity and discomfort as they watched a black woman in a luxury car face off with a white cop. Harmon's hand closed around her wrist, yanking her toward the back of her Audi with a roughness that made her gasp. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Her chest tightened, fury surging beneath her calm facade. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice even. "You're resisting," he snapped, his grip tightening. "No," she shot back, "but I'm a lawyer, and I know my rights. You have no cause to detain me." He chuckled, a low, derisive sound that grated against her nerves. "A lawyer, huh? You expect me to believe that?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, I'm a civil rights attorney." "You're making a big mistake." But Harmon didn't hesitate. The handcuffs came out, cold metal snapping around her wrists, biting into her skin. The sting was nothing compared to the shame burning through her as she stood there, bound and helpless under the scrutiny of Hillcrest's elite. He didn't see her, didn't care to. To him, She was just another body to control, another lesson in power. We'll see about that, he muttered, shoving her toward his cruiser. Cassandra's mind roared with outrage as he opened the back door. She wanted to fight, to demand justice right there on the asphalt. But years of experience told her this wasn't the place. You'll regret this, she said softly, her voice a promise wrapped in steel. He smirked again. We'll see, lawyer. The door slammed shut, and the cruiser's engine growled to life. She sat rigid in the unforgiving seat, wrists aching, staring out at the blurred streets of Hillcrest. Her reflection in the window was a ghost, tears brimming but never falling. Harmon's eyes flicked to the mirror, watching her. But she didn't give him the satisfaction of breaking. This wasn't over. It was a spark, a call to warn she'd fight with every ounce of her strength. Because justice wasn't just a word to her, it was a debt, and she'd make damn sure it was paid. The air inside the police cruiser felt thick, almost suffocating. As Cassandra Brooks sat in the back seat, her wrists bound tightly by cold metal cuffs. She didn't need to see Officer Harmon's face to feel the disdain rolling off him in waves. It was there in the way he carried himself, the slight tilt of his head, the dismissive huff he let out every few seconds. It wasn't just arrogance, it was something deeper, a condescension so ingrained it seemed to pulse through his every word and action. To him, this wasn't a simple arrest. No, this was personal, a chance to strip her down, to peel away every shred of dignity she'd fought so hard to build over the years, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The injustice of it burned in her chest, but she kept her face composed, her breathing steady. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and tense, until Harmon's voice cut through it like a jagged knife. So, lawyer, huh, he said, his tone dripping with mockery as he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Guess you think you're something real special, don't you? Cruising around in that fancy car like you own the world. Cassandra stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the back of his head, refusing to take the bait. She could feel the heat of his words, the way he was itching to get a rise out of her. But she wasn't about to play into his hands. She'd faced worse than him, with sharper tongues and bigger ego sand. She'd come out on top every time. Her silence, though, only seemed to stoke his fire. I've seen your kind before. He pressed on, his voice growing tighter, laced with a venom he barely bothered to hide. Think you can buy your way out of anything, huh? Flash that degree. Toss around some fancy legal jargon, and everyone's supposed to just fall at your feet. Not today. Sweetheart, not with me. Cassandra's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue a moment longer, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, cutting through his bluster with surgical precision. You're making a mistake, Officer Harmon, she said, her gaze unwavering as it bored into the back of his skull. You've got no reason to hold me. No probable cause, nothing. This is going to come back to haunt Yowie, promise you that. Her words weren't a threat. They were a cold, hard truth, delivered with the weight of someone who knew the law inside and out. Harmon let out a soft, bitter chuckle, shaking his head as if she'd just told him a bad joke. Is that right? He muttered, his tone thick with disbelief. A threat from the big-shot lawyer? Cute. It's not a threat, Cassandra replied, her voice never wavering, her eyes still locked on him. It's a fact. I know the law better than you could ever hope to, and you just broke it. Badly. Harmon didn't respond right away, just smirked and turned the wheel, guiding the cruiser down a quieter street lined with bare trees and flickering streetlights. The police station loomed ahead, a squat brick building that stood in stark contrast to the polished wealth of Hillcrest, the neighborhood where he'd pulled her over. We'll see about that, he said under his breath, as if daring her to prove him wrong. When they pulled up to the precinct, the gravel crunched beneath the tires and Harmon stepped out, slamming his door with a force that echoed in the chilly night air. A moment later, he yanked Cassandra's door open, his rough hand clamping around her arm as he hauled her out of the car. The sudden jolt sent a sharp pain shooting through her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She wouldn't give him that. Around them, a handful of officers lingered near the entrance, their faces a mix of idle curiosity and practiced indifference. Some glanced up, their eyes lingering on her for a moment before drifting away, while others didn't bother looking at all. Cassandra straightened her spine, her head held high despite the cuffs biting into her skin. She'd faced worse than decades of systemic racism. Courtroom battles against people who thought power came with a title or a badge. This wasn't her first time staring down injustice, and she knew deep in her bones it wouldn't be her last, but she refused to let it break her. Not here, not now. Inside, the station buzzed with low-level chaos phones ringing faintly, officers shuffling papers, the hum of fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting a harsh, ghostly glow across the room. Harmon marched her toward the front desk, where an older sergeant sat, his face etched with exhaustion and years of routine. The man barely looked up as they approached, his fingers hovering over a worn keyboard. He glanced at Cassandra for a split second, then shifted his tired eyes to Harmon, one bushy eyebrow arching slightly. "Another one?" he asked, his voice flat, as if this were just another Tuesday night. "Yep," Harmon grunted, tossing Cassandra's ID and registration onto the desk with a flick of his wrist. "Caught her driving through Hillcrest. Car's too damn expensive for her to own, but she's claiming it's hers." The sergeant's gaze slid back to Cassandra, his expression unreadable, like a mask carved from stone. Without a word, he turned to his computer and started typing, the clack of the keys filling the silence. Cassandra stood motionless, her hands throbbing from the tight cuffs, her heart pounding with a quiet fury she kept locked behind her calm exterior. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, some curious, some indifferent, a few openly skeptical. The station hummed around her, but in her little corner, time seemed to crawl. Every second stretched into an eternity, her reputation, her dignity, her entire career hanging in the balance in this dingy, flickering room. A sudden beep from the sergeant's computer jolted the air. He squinted at the screen, his brow furrowing as he leaned in closer. Then he looked up at Harmon, his weary face shifting just a flicker of something new, something cautious. Harmon," he said, hesitating as his eyes darted back to the monitor. "You might want to take a look at this." Harmon frowned, irritation flashing across his features as he leaned over the desk. "What?" he snapped. The sergeant cleared his throat, then swiveled the screen toward him. "Brooks, Cassandra Brooks." He read aloud, his voice slowing as the weight of the words sank in. "Civil rights lawyer. High-profile cases. Been on CNN. You sure about this?" For the first time since he'd pulled her over, Harmon's smug confidence faltered. He bent closer to the screen, his jaw tightening as he scanned the profile, the reality of who she was crashing over him like a wave. His breath caught for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier bravado. This is a mistake," he muttered, barely audible. Cassandra's lips pressed into a thin, steely line, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that could have cut glass. "I told you," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "You're making a big mistake." Harmon straightened up, his face hardening again as he shoved the paperwork back at the sergeant. "Get her processed," he barked, but the command lacked its earlier bite. The sergeant raised an eyebrow, his skepticism plain. "You sure? This could blow back unushered." Harmon's gaze flickered between the screen and Cassandra, his pride warring with the dawning realization that he'd stepped into a mess, far bigger than he'd bargained for. Just do it," he snapped, his frustration boiling over as he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. The cuffs came off with a reluctant clank, but the damage was already done. The humiliation had played out in front of everyone: officers, the sergeant. The flickering lights and Harmon's feeble attempts to cling to control were as flimsy as tissue paper. Cassandra rubbed her aching wrists, her posture still tall and unbroken. She turned to the sergeant, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I'll be filing charges for this unlawful detainment," she said. "I want my lawyer Harino. And trust me, this isn't going to end with a slap on the wrist." The sergeant exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with another officer nearby, who shifted his weight and looked away. Harmon, now visibly sweating, muttered something incoherent under his breath before disappearing down the hall. Cassandra stood there, unbowed, her mind already racing ahead. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Harmon's arrogance, his abuse of power, would come back to haunt him, just as she'd warned. She'd been disrespected, humiliated, treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of her skin and the car she drove. But now, the tide was turning. As she waited for her lawyer, she steeled herself for the battle to come. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore, it was about justice, not just for her, but for every person who'd ever been crushed under the weight of a badge wielded like a weapon. Later, the door to the interrogation room creaked open, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. Harmon stepped inside, his posture stiff, his face a mask of forced composure. He shut the door behind him with a thud that reverberated through the small, barren space. Cassandra sat at the metal table, her wrists free now, but the weight of the day still pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her lawyer was already on the way, and she knew the station would have no choice but to release her soon. Yet here was Harmon, back again, unwilling or unable to let this go. "Miss Brooks," he said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his voice tight. "Seems like you've caused quite a stir." Cassandra raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp enough to pierce through his bravado. "I caused a stir." She let out a dry, bitter laugh that echoed faintly in the room. "I'm not the one who pulled someone over for driving a nice car, Officer Harmon." His face twitched, a flicker of irritation breaking through his carefully constructed mask. But he didn't bite back right away. Instead, he stepped closer, looming over the table, his shadow falling across her. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and defiance. Suing the department, Cassandra leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with deliberate calm. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "You violated my rights, and you think this is just going to vanish?" "Yes, Officer Harmon. I'm suing your department, and I'll make damn sure this is the last time you think you can get away with something like this." His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I didn't humiliate you," he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I was doing my job." Cassandra's eyes flashed, her patience wearing thin. "Your job?" she scoffed, leaning forward now, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "Your job is to uphold the law, not your own twisted biases. You had no reason to stop me, no cause to cuff me, no justification for treating me like a criminal. You know it, I know it, and soon, everyone else will too." Harmon opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He ran a hand over his face, his frustration palpable, the weight of his actions pressing down on him harder than he'd expected. "You think this is about race?" he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost defensive. "It wasn't about race. I don't care what color you are. I was suspicious because of where you were, what you were driving. It's my job to investigate." "Investigate what?" Cassandra fired back, her voice steady, but laced with righteous anger. "A black woman driving a luxury car in a neighborhood where you decided she doesn't belong? That's what this is about, and you know it." Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching, daring him to deny it. Harmon didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered, the cracks in his authority widening with every passing second. The silence between them grew thick, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead. Cassandra could see it in his iced internal struggle, the clash between his pride and the slow, creeping realization that he'd overplayed his hand. But this wasn't about Harmon's epiphany, or his guilt, or his regret. This was about her, about the countless times she'd faced racism dressed up as suspicion, bias cloaked in the trappings of power. She'd spent her career fighting it in courtrooms across the country, dismantling it piece by piece. Now she was living it, breathing it, feeling it in every fiber of her being. There would be no undoing what he'd done, no apology that could erase the sting of this moment. But there would be consequences. Justice demanded it, not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever stood where she stood now. Caught in the crosshairs of power abused, Harmon shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her stare. He turned abruptly, heading for the door, but not before muttering something under his breath, too low for her to catch, too weak to matter. As the door clicked shut behind him, Cassandra leaned back in her chair, her mind already mapping out the fight ahead. This wasn't just a personal victory she was after, it was a reckoning. For Harmon, for the system he represented, for every unchecked abuse of power that had come before. The law was her weapon, and she'd wield it with precision. ensuring that the lesson sank deep. Justice wasn't a privilege to be granted, it was a right to be claimed, and those who trampled it would face the consequences. The sting of that roadside encounter gnawed at Cassandra Brooks like a persistent ache she couldn't shake. The memory of the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the sharp bark of Officer Harmon's voice ordering her out of her sleek, hard-earned sedan, it all replayed in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. Now, sitting across from him in the dim, claustrophobic interrogation room, she felt the weight of every unjust glance she'd ever endured pressing down on her chest. Her voice, though soft as a whisper carried over a still night, held an unshakable resolve as she spoke. "You can't possibly know what it's like," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet ferocity. "You'll never understand the exhaustion of being judged not for your actions, not for your choices, but for the very skin you were born in. Every time I step into a room, every time I drive through a pristine neighborhood like the one you patrol, people like you size me up in an instant and decide I'm out of place." Harmon shifted in his seat, the metal chair creaking beneath him. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, betraying a flicker of discomfort. But Cassandra wasn't about to let him off that easily. She leaned forward, her words spilling out like a slow, deliberate stream cutting through stone. "I've spent my whole life clawing my way to where I am today. That car out there, I earned every inch of it, every payment, every mile. I've earned the right to drive wherever I damn well please without someone like you assuming I'm a thief or a thug. But the second you saw me, none of that mattered. All you saw was the color of my skin, and that was enough for you to erase everything I've built." The officer's gaze dropped to the scuffed tabletop, avoiding the intensity of her stare. His silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken tension, but Cassandra wasn't finished. She pressed on, her voice sharpening like a blade honed by years of frustration. "And now you're sitting there, trying to tell me this wasn't about race. Please. If I looked like the people who live in those manicured houses you guard so fiercely, we wouldn't be here right now. You know it, and I know it." Harmon's hands tightened into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening under the strain. He drew in a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if he were wrestling with something deep inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with a defensiveness that surprised her. "You're not perfect either," he muttered, the words slipping out like a reflex he couldn't control. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." Cassandra's eyebrow arched, her surprise mingling with curiosity. She hadn't expected him to push back not like this. For a moment, she studied him, noting the way his jaw clenched, the faint tremor in his hands. This wasn't about her anymore. She could hear it in the cracks of his tone. He was crumbling under the weight of his own guilt, and it intrigued her enough to keep listening. "Oh," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a challenge. "Then why don't you enlighten me, Officer Harmon? What's made you so quick to slap your assumptions on someone like me?" He didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted toward the door, a fleeting glance that hinted at an urge to bolt from the room and escape the conversation entirely. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows across his face as he wrestled with his next move. Then, with a heavy sigh that seemed to drag his whole body down, he sank into the chair across from her. His expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, almost reluctant. "My dad," he began, the words tumbling out slowly, as if they'd been buried too long. "He was a cop too, a good one, everyone said. Respected, tough. But he didn't see people like you the way you see yourselves. He had his own ideas about the world, and he drilled them into me, whether I asked for it or not." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, her mind racing to piece together where this confession was headed. She could feel the anger simmering in her chest, but it was tempered now by a threat of something else, sepity, perhaps, or a reluctant curiosity. "Go on," she said, her tone cool but insistent. Harmon rubbed the back of his neck, his calloused fingers digging into the tense muscle as if trying to knead away the discomfort. "When I was a kid, I had this best friend, really. He was black. We'd spend hours together, running around the neighborhood, playing ball, getting into trouble like kids do. It didn't mean anything to me back then, the difference between us. But one day, my dad saw us out in the yard. He pulled me aside later that night, his face all hard lines and disapproval. Told me I couldn't hang around with his kind anymore. Said I didn't belong with them. So I listened. I stopped seeing him. Cassandra's chest tightened as she absorbed his words, the rawness of the memory cutting through her defenses. She could picture it clearly, a wide-eyed boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing in the glow of a porch light as his father's voice laid down a law he didn't fully understand. Her anger flared anew, but it was laced with a pang of sorrow for the child Harmon had been and the man he'd become. That was the first time I realized what my dad really thought about black people, he continued, his voice straining under the weight of the admission. And after that, I don't know, it's like I couldn't unsee it. I stopped seeing people like my friend for who they were. All I could see was what my dad wanted me to see. A long silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, for the first time. Cassandra glimpsed something fragile in him, a flicker of vulnerability that softened the edges of her fury. But it wasn't enough to absolve him. It wasn't an excuse. So you grew up learning to hate people who look like me, she said, her tone measured but unyielding. And now you think that explains what you did today? Harmon shook his head quickly, his face flushing a deep red. No, it doesn't explain it. It doesn't justify anything. I'm not saying that. But I didn't see it, not really, until this moment. Until I saw how I treated you. How wrong it was. Cassandra stared at him, the silence between them swelling with the gravity of his words. She could see the fractures in his composure, guilt eating at him, the confusion twisting his features, but it didn't erase the humiliation she'd endured. It didn't undo the way he'd stripped her of her dignity on the side of that quiet, tree-lined road. I don't need your apology, Officer Harmon, she said finally, rising to her feet with a grace that belied the storm raging inside her. What I need is for people like you to stop hiding behind your pasts and your excuses. You made a choice to die, a choice rooted in power you abused, and now you'll have to face the consequences of it. With that, she turned on her heel, her footsteps echoing against the cold linoleum as she strode toward the door. She didn't look back, but she could feel Harmon's eyes on her, could sense the weight of his realization settling into the empty space she left behind. His face, etched with the burden of everything he'd just lost, this certainty. His pride remained fixed in her mind as she stepped out of the room. The precinct's hallways stretched before her, sterile and unforgiving, the fluorescent lights glaring down like a spotlight she couldn't escape. As she moved through the bustle of officers and ringing phones, she felt their gaze, some curious, some indifferent, a few tinged with unease. She wasn't just another name on a report anymore. She was Cassandra Brooks, a woman whose story was about to ripple far beyond these walls. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the crisp evening waiting outside. Her chest still carried the heaviness of the confrontation, but there was a spark of resolve igniting beneath it, a fire she intended to stoke. Near the front desk, her lawyer, Alan Greenberg, waited with a styrofoam cup of water in hand. A weary man in his early 40s, he had the sharp, restless energy of someone who thrived in chaos. His dark eyes flicked over her as she approached, reading the tension in her posture like an open book. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady as he handed her the cup. Cassandra took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The water was lukewarm, but it soothed the dryness in her throat. "I'm fine," she said, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving her drained but resolute. Harmon tried to talk. "He's drowning in guilt, but it doesn't change what he did." Alan nodded, his eyes narrowing with a mix of determination and anticipation. "He should feel guilty, and he's about to feel a whole lot more when we're done with him. We've got enough here to file the lawsuit by morning. The media's already circling, porters are itching for a story, and this is going to explode faster than we can blink." Cassandra exhaled slowly, her breath shaky as her mind spun with the implications. She'd known this was coming from the moment Harmon's cuffs had clicked round her wrists, but now that the wheels were in motion, the reality felt like a boulder pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a reckoning for a system that had crushed too many people under its weight. She glanced at Alan, catching the glint of confidence in his expression, and felt a flicker of doubt. "I know what's at stake," she said, her gaze drifting across the precinct. Officers moved briskly round them, One behind the desk whispering into a phone with a furrowed brow, others casting sit-along glances her way. Word was spreading like wildfire. But this isn't just another case for me, Alan. This is personal. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. It's personal for a lot of people. Cass, you're not carrying this alone. You've got the law on your side, and you know better than anyone how to wield it. What happens here is going to set a precedent, not just for you, but for everyone who's been through this kind of hell. She knew he was right. She'd always known this was bigger than her own pain. But the emotional toll was sinking its claws in deep. She'd fought countless battles in courtrooms, her sharp mind and steady voice dismantling opponents with precision. But this was her dignity on the line, her life laid bare for the world to judge. It was a fight she couldn't afford to lose, and the stakes felt suffocating. Just then, the precinct doors burst open with a clamor that jolted her from her thoughts. A swarm of reporters flooded in, cameras flashing like a storm of lightning, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Miss Brooks," one shouted, elbowing through the crowd. "Are you filing a lawsuit against the police?" Another voice cut in, sharp and insistent. "Do you believe Officer Harmon targeted you because of your race?" Alan stepped in front of her instinctively, a shield against the onslaught. But it was too late. They'd spotted her, and the feeding frenzy had begun. The questions came fast and furious, each one louder, more demanding, threatening to drown her in their noise. But Cassandra straightened her spine, drawing on the strength she'd honed over years of facing down adversaries. She'd been in front of cameras before. She knew how to command a room, even when her heart was pounding and her hands still shook from the day's ordeal. Raising a hand, she silenced the crowd just enough to make her voice heard. "Yes," she began, her tone steady and resonant, cutting through the din like a blade. "I will be filing a lawsuit against the department for unlawful detainment and racial discrimination. What happened to me today, being pulled over, handcuffed, and humiliated, wasn't about anything I did wrong. It was about who I am, about the fact that I don't fit the image of someone who belongs driving a luxury car through a wealthy neighborhood." The cameras flashed wildly, capturing every word as her voice rose with a passion she could no longer contain. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her eyes blazing with conviction. "It's about every black man and woman who's been stopped, questioned, or harassed for no reason other than daring to exist in a space where someone decided they don't belong. We can't keep letting this happen. We need accountability. We need justice. We need change." The reporters erupted again, their voices clamoring for more, but Alan intervened, guiding her toward the exit with a practiced efficiency. She'd said enough. Her words were out there now, a spark that would ignite a firestorm across the city. As they stepped into the cool evening air, the breeze brushed against her face, a fleeting relief from the suffocating heat of the precinct. Her head still buzzed with the weight of it all, but beneath the exhaustion, she felt a quiet surge of purpose. The fight had begun, and she was ready to see it through. Alan was already on his phone, barking orders to his press team, arranging interviews, crafting statements. Cassandra listened for a moment, then let her mind drift back to Harmon, his slumped shoulders, his fractured confession. He'd been shaped by a legacy of prejudice, but that didn't absolve him. Justice demanded consequences, not just for him, but for the system that empowered his actions. And as the city lights glittered in the distance, she knew this was only the beginning of a battle that would test her resolve and reshape the world around her. The air clung to Dr. Marcus Hayes like a thick, damp shroud as he tore through the city streets that sweltering summer night. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down his temples in steady streams, his breath coming in sharp, determined bursts. Each pounding step against the fractured asphalt echoed with purpose, the rhythmic thud of his sneakers a testament to the urgency driving him forward. The backpack slung haphazardly over one shoulder jostled with every stride, its contents vials of medicine, bandages, tools of healing riddling faintly, a quiet chorus of hope amidst the chaos. The hospital loomed just a few blocks ahead, a beacon in the humid darkness, and Marcus could almost feel the weight of the patient waiting for him, their life hanging on the thin thread of his speed. As he rounded a corner, his pace quickened, legs burning with the effort, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the hospital's entrance piercing through the night. Meanwhile, miles away, Cassandra Brooks sat alone in her car, the engine humming softly beneath her as she gripped the steering wheel. Her chest felt tight, not from exhaustion, but from the storm of emotions swirling within her anger, resolve, and a flicker of something like hope. The memory of that fateful day still lingered. Sharp and unyielding, Officer Jake Harmon's smug voice, cutting through the quiet of her routine drive, his hands rough as he yanked her from her vehicle, the cold bite of handcuffs against her wrists. She could still hear the excuses he barked some nonsense about a taillight, a flimsy pretense for the humiliation that followed. That moment had stripped her bare, not just of her dignity, but of the illusion that justice was blind. Now, as she stared out at the city lights blurring past her windshield, her phone buzzed insistently on the passenger seat. A text from her assistant glowed on the screen. CNN wants an interview tomorrow. MSNBC too. You're going national. Cassandra's lips pressed into a thin line, her dark eyes narrowing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Harmon may have lit the spark, but she would fan it into a blaze that no one could ignore. Across town, Alan Carter, her steadfast lawyer, paced the dimly lit confines of his office, the faint hum of the air conditioner doing little to ease the tension knotting his shoulders. Papers littered his desk, legal briefs, witness statements, a meticulously crafted case that had consumed his every waking hour. He paused by the window, peering out at the shadowed streets below, his mind replaying their last conversation. Cassandra's voice had been firm, unyielding. He didn't make a mistake, Alan. He made a choice. Alan's jaw tightened as he recalled the weight of her words, the raw truth in them. He'd seen the crack in Harmon's armor during their confrontation by her car, a fleeting glimmer of realization in the officer's eyes, but it hadn't been enough, not nearly enough to undo the damage. Alan knew the department was already scrambling, spinning their narrative. Harmon was just doing his job, a good cop caught in a bad moment. The thought made his stomach churn. He turned back to his desk, determination settling over him like a second skin. They'd fight this, not just for Cassandra, but for every soul the system had failed. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, a hive of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the polished wooden benches and high ceilings. Cassandra sat at the plaintiff's table, her fingers digging into the edge of the worn oak surface, grounding herself against the tidal wave of nerves threatening to pull her under. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat a reminder of what this trial had become, a crucible, a reckoning, a symbol far bigger than her alone. The gallery was packed to bursting, civil rights activists clutching signs scrawled with demands for justice, journalists scribbling furiously in notebooks, even a handful of local politicians shifting uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the eyes on them. News vans lined the courthouse steps outside, their cameras poised like vultures circling a kill, hungry for the verdict that would ripple across the nation. Across the room, Officer Jake Harmon sat rigid at the defense table, his uniform replaced by a stiff gray suit that seemed to hang on him like a shroud. His face was pale, almost ghostly, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could will himself invisible. Gone was the swaggering arrogance Cassandra remembered from that ninth man who'd loomed over her, barking orders with a sneer, secure in his unchecked power. Now, he was a husk, diminished by the weight of the trial. His lawyer had spun a desperate tale, a routine stop gone awry, a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But Cassandra's team had dismantled it piece by piece, laying bare the ugly truth of racial bias that had fueled his actions. As the judge re-entered, the room rose in unison. A collective breath held as the air grew thick with expectation. Alan caught her eye, offering a steady nod. But Cassandra felt the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was a cry for every black person who'd faced the same indignity. A demand that the system finally see them. The judge's voice cut through the silence, deliberate and measured, as he shuffled the papers before him. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Cassandra Brooks. A gasp swept through the room, followed by a swell of murmursome triumphant. Others stunned. Cassandra froze, her breath snagging in her throat as the words sank in. She'd won. The judge pressed on, his tone unwavering. The court also orders the police department to implement mandatory racial Bias training for all officers, effective immediately. Officer Harmon will face disciplinary action, including suspension without pay. Pending further review. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed like thunder. But the room erupted anyway, whispers rising into a cacophony. Cassandra's pulse raced, her hands trembling slightly as she exhaled a slow, shaky release of the tension she'd carried for months. This was more than a victory, it was a crack in the fortress of impunity, a step toward accountability. As the crowd thinned, Harmon rose unsteadily, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze flickered toward Cassandra, hesitant, almost fearful. Alan stiffened beside her, his protective instincts flaring, but she lifted a hand to still him. She wanted to hear this. Harmon shuffled closer, stopping a few feet away, his eyes finally meeting hers. The bravado was gone, replaced by a hollow vulnerability that made him look smaller, frailer. I just wanted to say, he began, his voice a hoarse whisper, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I see it now. I was wrong. His words hung between them, fragile and raw. Cassandra studied him, her emotions a tangled dance of fury and pity. Part of her wanted to lash out, to hurl his apology back in his face doesn't erase the nights I couldn't sleep, the fear I still carry. But another part saw the fracture in him, the faint dawn of awareness breaking through his ignorance. It wasn't absolution, not even close, but it was something. I'm glad you can see that now, she said at last, her voice steady despite the storm within. But it's not me you owe an apology to. It's every person you've ever treated like they were less than human. Every life you disrupted because you thought you could. The ones who didn't have a courtroom or a microphone to fight back. Harmon flinched, his shoulders sagging as her words landed like stones. He nodded once, a small, defeated gesture, then turned and walked away, his silhouette fading into the emptying room. Cassandra watched him go, a quiet resolve settling over her. This wasn't about him anymore, it was about her, about the countless others whose stories mirrored hers, about the system that had let men like Harmon wield power without consequence. Alan stepped up beside her, his face alight with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. We did it. Cassandra, you did it. She turned to him, a faint, weary smile tugging at her lips. We did. But this isn't the end, Alan. It's just the beginning. He nodded, understanding the depth beneath her words. This lawsuit was a hard-won battle, but the war against a system rotten with bias stretched far beyond this courtroom. The reforms were a start, a fragile, imperfect start, but the road ahead was long, winding through a landscape of entrenched privilege and indifference. As they stepped outside, the courthouse doors swinging wide, a swarm of reporters descended, their shouts overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Cameras flashed, blinding in their intensity, and microphones jabbed toward her like spears. Miss Brooks, how does it feel to have won? One voice rose above the din. Cassandra paused, the weight of the question settling over her. She thought of the arrest, humiliation searing her memory like a brand. She thought of the endless nights preparing for this fight, the faces in the gallery today, the countless others watching from afar. It feels like justice, she said finally, her voice clear and unwavering. But it's only one piece of it. What happened to me happens every day across this country. People targeted, humiliated, silenced. Most don't have the chance I did to fight back. This isn't just about me. It's about changing a system that's failed too many for too long. The questions kept coming, but Cassandra raised a hand, silencing the clamor. The fight doesn't stop here. This is a step, but we've got miles to go. We need accountability. We need reform. We need to make sure no one else endures what I did or worse. With that, she turned, Alan at her side, and made her way to the waiting car. The crowd parted reluctantly, their voices fading as she slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away, she gazed out the window, the city unfurling before her in a blur of lights and shadows. The victory pulsed through her, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. The journey ahead loomed large, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet name, but she was ready. Today, justice had prevailed, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to light the way forward. And as the car sped into the night, Cassandra knew this was only the start of something greater, a story still unfolding, a fight that would echo far beyond her own. Back in the streets, Dr. Marcus Hayes reached the hospital at last. His chest heaving as he burst through the doors, the cool air hit him like a shock, a stark contrast to the stifling heat outside. Nurses glanced up, startled, then sprang into action as he barked orders. His voice steady despite his exhaustion. The patient, a young woman, barely clinging to life, needed him, and every second mattered. As he worked, hands moving with practiced precision, he couldn't shake the thought of Cassandra's fight, a story he'd caught fragments of on the radio between shifts. Her victory wasn't his, but it resonated, a reminder that justice, like healing, was a battle fought one painstaking step at a time. And in that moment, as he fought to save a life, he felt the same fire that drove her, a refusal to let the brokenness of the world win. The traffic light pulsed a furious red, casting an eerie glow across the empty street, and Marcus Hayes felt his heart hammering against his ribcage like a trapped bird, desperate to break free. Pressure was no stranger to him. It clung to his every step, a constant companion woven into the fabric of his life. As a doctor who held the fragile threads of human existence in his hands daily, he had grown accustomed to its weight. The sharp tang of hospital disinfectant lingered in his nostrils, a scent so familiar it might as well have been his own breath. In his mind, the steady beep of heart monitors played like a relentless melody, a rhythm that underscored his every waking moment. But tonight, that familiar tune shattered, ripped apart by the piercing squeal of tires grinding against asphalt and the wail of a siren slicing through the stillness. He froze mid-stride, chest heaving, and whipped his head around. A police car screeched to a halt beside him, its red and blue lights spinning wildly, painting the scene in frantic, disjointed flashes. The door flung open, and Officer Ryan Mitchell emerged, his movements swift and deliberate, one hand resting on the holster at his hip. His eyes locked onto Marcus with a steely intensity that made the air feel thick and suffocating. "Hey, you there," Mitchell's voice boomed, sharp and commanding, as he closed the distance between them with long, purposeful strides. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his trembling limbs as he raised his hands. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a moment like this, and a part of him, a weary, weathered part, knew the drill. He could feel the sweat prickling at the back of his neck, but he steadied himself, drawing on years of discipline. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice measured despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm on my way to the hospital. There's a critical patient waiting for me. These are medical supplies." He gestured faintly toward the backpack slung over his shoulder, its weight a lifeline to someone clinging to survival. But Mitchell wasn't listening. His gaze raked over Marcus, lingering on the backpack with a suspicion that twisted his features into something hard and unyielding. To him, Marcus wasn't a doctor racing against time. He was a black man sprinting through the night with a bulging bag, and in Mitchell's mind, that painted a picture far darker than the truth. "Robbery," Mitchell muttered under his breath, the words slipping out just loud enough for Marcus to catch it, like a spark igniting dry tinder. "Open the backpack." Marcus hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. Every second spent here was a second stolen from his patient, a life teetering on the edge, slipping further out of reach. He could feel the urgency clawing at him, a desperate ache that screamed for action. But Mitchell's tone brooked no defiance, his stance radiating authority laced with menace. "I told you, I'm a doctor," Marcus repeated, fighting to keep his voice even as frustration simmered beneath his skin, hot and restless. He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out his badge, holding it up like a shield. "Look at this. I'm Dr. Marcus Hayes from Central Hospital. Please, just let me go." Mitchell didn't even glance at the ID. Instead, he lunged forward, his hand clamping onto the backpack and yanking it off Marcus's shoulder with a force that sent Marcus stumbling backward. The sudden aggression jolted through him, a shockwave of disbelief and indignation. "I'm not telling you again," Mitchell snapped, his voice heavy with distrust, each syllable dripping with the weight of a verdict already passed. "Open it." Marcus swallowed hard, the bitter taste of humiliation scorching his throat. His face burned as he unzipped the bag with deliberate slowness, revealing its contents, vials of medicine glinting faintly in the streetlight, surgical tools nestled in sterile packaging, masks folded neatly in a stack. This was his arsenal, his means of waging war against death itself. Mitchell's eyes flicked over the items, but his expression remained cold, unsoftened by the evidence before him. "And where'd you steal this from?" he asked, his voice low and accusing, his narrowed eyes boring into Marcus like twin daggers. For a fleeting moment, Marcus closed his eyes, wrestling with the urge to scream, to lash out against the absurdity of it all. His chest tightened, a coiled spring of rage and despair threatening to snap, but he knew with a bone-deep certainty born of too many encounters, like this, that losing control would only tighten the noose. With a Herculean effort, he forced his voice to remain steady. "I didn't steal anything. These are medical supplies. I'm a doctor, and I need to get to the hospital now. I have a patient dying." Mitchell's skepticism didn't waver. In one fluid, unyielding motion, he seized Marcus's arm, his grip iron-tight, and spun him around, slamming him against the hood of the patrol car. The metal seared against Marcus's palms, hot from the engine's hum, and the officer's weight pinned him there, a suffocating force that crushed both body and spirit. The cold click of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, each metallic clank a blow to his dignity, reverberating in the stillness like a judge's gavel. "You have the right to remain silent," Mitchell intoned, his voice mechanical, detached, as if Marcus were just another faceless threat to be subdued. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is ridiculous." Marcus's voice finally broke free, a raw shout that tore from his throat as he strained against the cuffs, his cheek pressed into the hood, the heat stinging his skin. But it was nothing compared to the fire blazing inside him. "I didn't do anything. I'm a doctor, damn it. You're going to kill someone by holding me here." Mitchell ignored him, his gun still lowered, but its presence a constant, unspoken threat. With a rough shove, he forced Marcus into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a thunderous bang that echoed down the desolate street. Inside, Marcus struggled to catch his breath, the stale air of the car pressing against his lungs. His eyes darted to the dashboard clock, its glowing digits ticking relentlessly forward. Each passing second tightened the knot in his stomach, a vice of dread and helplessness. His patient Somion's father, someone's life lineage was fading, and he was trapped here, shackled by prejudice as much as by steel. Frustration morphed into a bitter cocktail of fear and despair, and he slammed his cuffed hands against the seat, the sharp clang only amplifying his powerlessness. "Do you even know what you're doing?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and desperation. "That patient, it's your boss, Captain Roberts. He's dying, and I'm the only one who can help." Mitchell's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Marcus's in the rearview mirror. For the first time, a flicker of doubt shadowed his face, a crack in the armor of his certainty. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, the silence between them thick and suffocating. The tension hung heavy, a tangible weight that smothered any hope of understanding. Then the radio crackled to life, its static hiss cutting through the stillness like a blade. The operator's voice spilled out, urgent and clipped. "Emergency update, Captain Roberts is in critical condition. Immediate medical attention required." Mitchell stiffened, his widened eyes betraying a sudden, visceral panic. The Nemehis boss. His captain hit him like a punch to the gut, unlocking a belated realization that left him reeling. "Damn it," he cursed, his voice a ragged mix of disbelief and dread. He scrambled out of the car, fumbling with the keys as he yanked open the back door. His hands shook as he pulled Marcus out, the desperation in his movements a stark contrast to his earlier confidence. "I am sorry," he stammered, the words tumbling out awkwardly, laced with a guilt he couldn't yet fully grasp. "You need to go. I didn't know." Marcus glared at him, the red marks of the cuffs stuck against his wrists, his eyes blazing with a fury tempered only by the urgency that still drove him. He shoved past Mitchell without a word, breaking into a run toward the hospital, his legs pumping with a ferocity born of necessity. Mitchell stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring into the void where Marcus had been, the weight of his mistake crashing over him like a tidal wave. Then, as if jolted awake, he sprinted after him, his boots pounding the pavement, carrying a regret that gnawed at his soul. The hospital loomed ahead, its flickering lights spilling into the night like a beacon of chaos and hope. Inside, the corridors buzzed with frenetic energy. Nurses darted back and forth, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor, while the incessant hum of monitors filled the air with a mechanical heartbeat. The medical team hovered near the operating room, their faces taut with anxiety, their eyes darting toward the entrance with a mix of dread and expectation. When Marcus burst through the doors, panting and disheveled, a collective breath of relief rippled through them. He didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the looks of gratitude or the murmured words of encouragement. He charged straight to the operating room, shedding the weight of the night's injustice like a second skin as he stepped into his domain. Mitchell lingered outside, a shadow against the wall, unable to tear himself away. Through the window, he watched the flurry of motion nurses adjusting monitors, doctors prepping instruments, all orbiting Marcus like planets around a sun. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, his stomach churning with a nauseating blend of guilt and shame. He'd never imagined a routine stop could spiral into this a public, humiliating, and potentially deadly misstep. He wanted to step forward, to stammer out an apology, to explain that he'd only meant to protect, to serve. But the words lodged in his throat, choked by the memory of how he'd pinned Marcus to the car, treated him like a thief instead of a healer. Each minute that ticked by felt like a lifetime, and he stood there, a powerless witness to the consequences of his own hand. Inside the operating room, Marcus scrubbed in, the ritual a grounding force amid the storm. The sterile scent of antiseptic washed over him, a balm to his frayed nerves, and as he slipped on his gloves, he felt the familiar mantle of control settle over him. This was his sanctuary, a place where his hands held sway, where every incision, every suture, was a testament to his skill and resolve. But today, the stakes pressed harder. The weight of Captain Roberts' life and the injustice he'd just endured bearing down on his shoulders. The captain lay on the table, pale and still, a tangle of tubes and wires snaking across his chest. Time slipped through Marcus's fingers like sand, but he forced his mind to narrow, to block out the chaos of the night and zero in on the task ahead. The surgery began, and Marcus's hands moved with a precision that bordered on artistry. Sweat trickled beneath his mask, stinging his eyes, but he didn't falter. His commands were sharp and clipped, guiding the team with an authority that left no room for error. Around him, the nurses and assistants moved in sync, their trust in him absolute, their urgency a mirror to his own. Outside, Mitchell watched, his breath shallow, his fists clenched at his sides. He could see the strain in the team's faces, the gravity of the moment etched into every line, and he knew with a sickening clarity that his actions had brought them to this precipice. For Marcus, this was more than a surgery. It was a defiance of the odds, a stand against the clock, and above all, a reckoning with the justice he'd been denied. Every stitch was a quiet rebellion, every breath a testament to his resilience. For Mitchell, it was a lesson carved in regret, a stark reminder that power, wielded carelessly, could unravel lives in an instant. As the monitors beeped and the team fought to pull Captain Roberts back from the brink, the night stretched on, a fragile thread of hope binding them all in its unyielding grip. In the dimly lit operating room, the air buzzed with urgency as Dr. Marcus Hayes fought to keep Captain Roberts tethered to life. The situation teetered on a knife's edge, each second a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. The monitors screeched their relentless warnings, jagged lines spiking and plummeting across the screens like a storm-tossed sea. Every beep reverberated through the sterile space, amplifying the suffocating tension that clung to the walls. Marcus stood at the center of it all, acutely aware of the weight of every gaze fixed upon him. Nurses, assistants, even the flickering shadows seemed to hold their breath, watching, waiting. Yet his focus remained unshaken, a fortress of calm amid the chaos. Sweat beaded on his brow, his heart pounded beneath his scrubs, but his hands moved with the steady precision of a sculptor chiseling marble. More pressure here, hold that line steady, he commanded, his voice cutting through the stillness as he gestured with the scalpel, its blade glinting faintly under the harsh lights. His assistants sprang into action, their movements swift and synchronized, adjusting clamps and swabs to keep the surgical field pristine. The silence that enveloped the room felt almost holy, broken only by the mechanical hum of machines and the shallow, restrained breaths of those around him. Marcus's mind raced, every fiber of his being attuned to the stakes, One misstep, one fleeting lapse, and Captain Roberts, a man he'd never truly known beyond these dire moments, would slip away forever. His fingers danced across the incision with a speed born of necessity, yet tempered by the quiet confidence of someone who had stared down the impossible time and again. Time stretched endlessly, each minute an eternity of doubt and determination, until at last, with a final, deliberate stitch, Marcus sealed the wound. He stepped back, chest heaving as he drew a deep, ragged breath. The monitor's erratic symphony softened into a tentative rhythm, fragile, but alive. Roberts had clawed his way back from the abyss, at least for now. Beyond the operating room's heavy doors, Officer Ry Mitchell lingered in the corridor, his back pressed against the cold wall. He watched the medical team emerge, their faces etched with exhaustion, yet softened by a flicker of relief. They dispersed like ghosts, fading into the hospital's labyrinthine halls, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Marcus appeared moments later, peeling off his blood-streaked gloves and mask with slow, deliberate motions. His face was a mask of weariness, his dark eyes shadowed by a storm of emotions he refused to unleash. Mitchell took a hesitant step forward, his boots scuffing the linoleum. But the sight of Marcus's distant, steely gaze froze him in place. "Dr. Hayes, I am really sorry," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a hoarse whisper. Guilt gnawed at his insides, a relentless beast clawing at his ribs, but his tongue felt clumsy. Inadequate to bear the weight of his regret, Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off mid-breath. The doctor's exhaustion was palpable, a heavy shroud that dulled the edges of Mitchell's apology until it sounded like a faint, meaningless hum in the distance. "Almost doesn't matter, officer," Marcus said, his voice low and firm, laced with the fatigue of a man who'd carried too much for too long. "What matters is what happened. You didn't listen. You didn't look past your own assumptions, your own wants. And that's what cuts the pest, not just for me, but for the people I'm here to save. You need to sit with that. Really think about it." Without another word, Marcus brushed past him, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall. Mitchell stood rooted to the spot, eyes dropping to the scuffed floor as his mind churned with a leaden heaviness. He wanted to call out, to spill more words into the void, but they felt hollow, insignificant, a flimsy bandage slapped over a wound he'd carved with his own hands. As the corridor stretched empty before him, a cold realization settled in his gut. For the first time, he began to unravel the tangled mess of his choicest snap judgments, the ingrained biases that had propelled him to this moment of reckoning. The next morning, Marcus returned to the hospital, slipping back into the rhythm of his work with the same meticulous dedication that had defined him for years. His hands moved with surgical precision, his voice steady as he issued instructions to his team. But beneath the surface, a quiet unease simmered. The staff greeted him with their usual deference, their nods and murmured hellos unchanged. Yet an awkward hush trailed him like a shadow. Everyone knew what had transpired the night before. Whispers had spread like wildfire through the hospital's bustling corridors, even if no one dared speak of it aloud. Marcus felt the weight of their unspoken questions, their sidelong glances, and it pressed against the raw edges of his pride. He was a man who'd built his life on resilience, who'd weathered storms of prejudice and doubt with an unyielding spirit. But this betrayal of trust had left a deeper mark than he cared to admit. In the doctor's lounge, he buried himself in patient charts, the crisp pages a lifeline to focus amidst the chaos of his thoughts. The door creaked open, and Dr. Elena Vargas stepped inside, her presence warm yet tentative. She was a friend, a confidant forged through years of shared triumphs and trials, and now her soft brown eyes searched his face with a concern she couldn't hide. "Marcus, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent as she settled into the chair beside him. He kept his gaze fixed on the charts, unwilling to let the cracks show. "I'm fine, Elena. Just trying to move forward. You know how it is," he replied. But the weariness in his tone betrayed him, a faint tremor she knew too well. She leaned closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "I know it's been a hell of a hit." Something like that it's not easy to shrug off and pretend everything's normal. Her words were a quiet lifeline, an offer of solace he couldn't fully accept. "It's not," he admitted, his voice tightening as irritation flared briefly. But I don't get to choose. My patients need me. I can't waste energy on nonsense like this." He paused, the weight of his own words pressing down harder. Elena nodded, her silence a steady presence that spoke louder than platitudes. She knew the armor Marcus wore, forged in the fires of a world that too often judged him before he could prove himself. But even the strongest armor could crack, and she saw the faint fissures now, the toll of carrying both his duty and his dignity. Outside, the hospital pulsed with life, doctors weaving through crowded hallways, nurses calling out orders, patients shuffling past with hope or despair in their eyes. The morning sun streamed through towering windows, casting golden beams across the linoleum, but its warmth couldn't reach the chill that lingered in Marcus's chest. Later that day, he slipped away for a rare moment of reprieve, walking to the corner cafe where the scent of roasted coffee and the hum of quiet chatter offered a fleeting escape. He sank into a chair by the window, cradling a steaming mug as he let his shoulders slump. If only for a moment. The world outside blurred into a soft haze, cars rolling by, pedestrians hurrying through the crisp March air, but inside, his thoughts churned relentlessly. Then the bell above the door jingled, and Mitchell stepped inside, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face a map of hesitation and resolve. He spotted Marcus and froze, one hand hovering on the doorknob as if retreat were still an option. But something wilt, perhaps, or a fragile spark of determination propelled him forward. He approached slowly, each step a quiet plea for a chance to speak. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice rough and uncertain, barely rising above the cafe's ambient murmur. Marcus looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with a neutrality that masked the storm beneath. The air between them thickened, charged with the ghosts of the night before, anger, regret, and the jagged edges of trust shattered. "What do you want, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone even but edged with a faint impatience. He wasn't in the mood for more half-hearted apologies, more words that rang empty against the reality of what had been done. Mitchell sat down across from him, swallowing hard as he removed his hat and set it on the table, a small gesture of vulnerability. His fingers fidgeted nervously, tracing the brim as he gathered his courage. "I know I screwed everything up," he said at last, his voice trembling with the weight of his admission. "I know sorry doesn't cut it, not after what I did. But I'm here because I need to figure out how to make this right. And I don't even know where to start." Meanwhile, Captain Roberts sat behind his desk, his pallor stark against the dark wood, a fresh scar peeking from the collar of his shirt. His office was austere, space-bare walls, a single window framing the gray afternoon sky, but his presence filled it with a quiet authority. When Mitchell entered, summoned by a curt phone call, he tried to square his shoulders, to summon the composure that had once come so easily. But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with a turmoil he couldn't suppress. "Sit down, Mitchell," Roberts said, his voice blunt, cutting through the room like a blade. Mitchell obeyed, perching stiffly on the edge of the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Roberts leaned forward, arms crossed, his gaze piercing as though he could see straight into the officer's soul. "I've heard about last night," he began, each word measured but heavy with disappointment. "And I'll be straight with you, I'm let down. You're a damn good cop, Mitchell, but you dropped the ball. You let me down, you let Dr. Hayes down, and worst of all, you let yourself down." The words landed like blows, and Mitchell's head dipped, the shame coiling tighter round his chest. He knew Roberts spoke the truth, and the fear that the stain might never wash out gnawed at him. "Captain," he started, but Roberts silenced him with a raised hand, the gesture sharp and final. "What you did was inexcusable. You've got to learn from it more than that. You've got to change. Mistakes like this don't just bruise egos, they cost lives. Mine almost ended because of it." Roberts exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with the memory of his brush with death. "There are programs training, awareness courses. You're going through them, and I don't mean just checking the boxes. Do it because it'll make you better, not just as a cop, but as a man." Mitchell nodded, a lump rising in his throat as gratitude warred with the sting of his failures. He left the office with a resolve hardening in his chest, a silent vow to confront his shortcomings head-on, to claw his way toward redemption one painful step at a time. Back at the hospital, Marcus pressed on, his hands steady as he tended to his patients, his voice calm as he reassured families in waiting rooms. But the incident had shifted something within him, a new wariness, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. He remained unwavering in his commitment, but the wounds of betrayal lingered, etched into the quiet moments between his duties. Elena watched him from afar, her heart aching for the friend who bore his burdens so silently. She knew he'd heal in time, that his strength would carry him through. But she also knew the cost of that resilience, the solitude it demanded, the scars it left behind. For Mitchell, the days ahead stretched like an uncharted road, each one shadowed by the echo of his mistake. He replayed that night, endless lithe rash decision. The arrogance of his certain title, it became a mirror he couldn't escape. Yet within that reflection, a flicker of hope emerged, a chance to rebuild not just his career, but the man he wanted to be. Their paths had diverged, yet they remained bound by that fateful night, a collision of duty, error, and consequence that reshaped them both. Justice, Marcus understood, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about facing the fallout of one's actions with unflinching honesty. For Mitchell, the lesson cut deeper. Power wielded carelessly was a blade that turned on its wielder, leaving wounds that demanded reckoning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital's gleaming facade, both men carried forward, their lives irrevocably altered by the choices of a single, shattering moment. Ever since that chaotic night, Marcus couldn't shake the relentless thoughts swirling in his mind, thoughts about how he'd been treated, how he'd been misjudged, how a single moment of prejudice had nearly ripped a life away. The memory clung to him like damp air after a storm, heavy and inescapable. He sat now in a dimly lit cafe, the faint hum of conversation and the clinking of cups fading into the background. As he faced Mitchell across a scratched wooden table, Marcus's dark eyes locked onto the officer's, steady and unyielding, searching for something, anything might hint at the man's true intentions. Mitchell's face, usually hardened by years on the force, softened under the weight of guilt. His brows furrowed as if wrestling with words he couldn't quite find. Marcus could sense the sincerity radiating from him, but it wasn't enough to melt the icy wall of distrust that had built up between them over time. "What do you want me to say, Mitchell?" Marcus's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and deliberate. "That everything's okay now, that it's all forgiven, because it's not. That night, you didn't see a doctor standing there trying to help. You saw a criminal. You didn't even give me a chance." The frustration that Marcus had kept buried for so long erupted, his words laced with a bitterness he could no longer suppress. He leaned forward slightly, his hands tightening into fists on the table as he relived the moment. Mitchell's barked orders, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into his wrists, the sheer humiliation of being treated like less than human when all he'd been doing was trying to save a life. "You didn't just make a mistake," he continued, his tone rising with each syllable. "You threw me to the ground like I was nothing, and I'm sorry doesn't erase that. It doesn't undo the fact that someone almost died, because you couldn't see past your own assumptions." Mitchell didn't flinch, though his hazel eyes flickered with shame. He nodded slowly, absorbing the sting of Marcus's words as if they were a punishment he'd long accepted he deserved. The officer's broad shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of his regret, and he ran a hand through his short, sandy hair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice steady but low. "I can't take back what I did. I know that. But I'm trying to make it mean something to make sure it doesn't happen again." He paused, his gaze dropping to the table for a moment before lifting to meet Marcus's eyes again, a spark of determination flickering within them. "I've started the awareness training Captain Robert pushed me toward. It's just the beginning, and I know it's nowhere near enough. But I want to do more than sit here and apologize. I want to help fix this, really fix it, not just for me, but for every officer out there who might make the same call I did." Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, the fabric of his jacket rustling softly as he leaned back in his chair. His mind churned, torn between two instincts, the urge to walk away, to leave this painful chapter behind him, and the quiet realization that Mitchell's offer might be a rare chance at something bigger. He'd spent years witnessing injustice, excesses of discrimination buried under layers of bureaucracy, hollow apologies that never led to action. And yet here was Mitchell, a man who'd wronged him so deeply, sitting across from him with a glimmer of accountability in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was more than Marcus had seen from most. He let the silence stretch between them, the distant clatter of dishes from the cafe's kitchen filling the void as he weighed his response. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but tinged with a reluctant openness. "If you're serious about this, Mitchell, then prove it. Words are key, actions are what count. I don't trust you right now, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. But if you mean what you say, then don't just change yourself. Change the system that let this happen in the first place." Mitchell's expression brightened ever so slightly, a faint relief washing over him as though Marcus's challenge had lifted a fraction of the burden he carried. He nodded again, more resolutely this time. "I will, Dr. Hayes. It's a long road, and I know I've got a lot to prove. But I hope one day not too far offy can show you I'm more than the guy who screwed up that night." With that, he rose from the table, his chair scraping softly against the tiled floor, and left Marcus alone with his thoughts. The cafe's warm glow seemed to dim as Mitchell's figure disappeared through the glass door, swallowed by the evening shadows outside. For Marcus, the days that followed carried a strange duality, a surface-level calm masking the storm still raging within him. He threw himself into his work at the hospital, but even the familiar rhythm of charts and patient rounds couldn't quiet the turmoil that lingered like a persistent ache. Determined to channel it into something constructive, he began attending community meetings, standing before groups of wary faces to spark conversations about discrimination and justice. His voice, steady and commanding, filled the small rooms as he shared his story, not just the incident with Mitchell, but the countless times he'd seen power misused, lives diminished by bias. To his surprise, Mitchell showed up at some of these gatherings, always lingering near the back, his presence quiet but unmistakable. The officer didn't speak much, choosing instead to listen intently, his notebook open as he jotted down criticisms and ideas with the focus of a man desperate to understand. Marcus watched him from the corner of his eye, noting the way Mitchell's jaw tightened at each recounted story of injustice, the way his pen paused as if the weight of the words sank deeper than he'd expected. Their paths, though separate, began to converge around a shared purpose: Marcus, the unwavering advocate driven by a hunger for fairness, and Mitchell, the humbled man seeking redemption through action. It wasn't a smooth journey. Marcus often felt the sting of skepticism from others at those meetings, their sit-along glances reminding him of the distrust he himself still harbored. Mitchell, meanwhile, grappled with the enormity of his task, the realization that changing a broken system meant confronting not just his own flaws, but those of an entire institution. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, casting golden streaks across the hospital's glass facade, Marcus stood outside, gazing at the building where he'd fought so hard to save lives. A quiet renewal stirred in his chest, not peace, not yet, but a flicker of hope that change, however small, was taking root. That weekend, the hospital settled into an uneasy calm, the usual bustle softened by the slower pace of Saturday shifts. Marcus sat alone in the doctor's lounge, the faint squeak of carts rolling through the halls and the murmur of distant voices filtering through the walls. He hunched over a stack of reports, his pen scratching across the pages as he reviewed patient updates. But his mind kept drifting back to that night with Mitchell. The memory was a shadow he couldn't outrun, tainting every interaction with a reminder of how quickly perception could twist reality. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and he glanced up to see a Nurse Alila, her name tag red hovering in the doorway, her expression a mix of hesitation and urgency. She clutched a tablet to her chest, her fingers tapping nervously against its edge. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice carefully measured, "there's someone here who wants to talk to you. It's urgent." Marcus didn't lift his eyes from the papers, his exhaustion making him curt. "Who is it?" "It's Captain Robert's wife," Leela replied, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "She's pretty worked up, says she needs to thank you in person for saving her husband. I told her it might not be the best time, but she wouldn't take no for an answer." Marcus's pen stilled, the name pulling him back to that frantic night in the ICU. Captain Robert lying motionless, surrounded by a tangle of tubes and monitors, his life hanging by a thread. The image had seared itself into Marcus's mind, a visceral reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. All because Mitchell's snap judgment had delayed care. He sighed, the weight of that memory pressing down on his already weary shoulders. "All right," he said at last, closing his laptop with a soft click. "Let her in." Moments later, Emily Roberts stepped into the room, her presence striking despite the exhaustion etched into her features. She was an elegant woman, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, but her red-rimmed eyes and the way she gripped her purse betrayed the toll of recent days. She approached Marcus with tentative steps, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again as emotion choked her words. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. "I'm Emily Roberts. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my husband's life, and I needed to tell you that myself. I know it's not enough, just saying it, but—" Marcus offered a small, weary smile, hoping to ease the tension coiling in the air between them. "Mrs. Roberts, I was just doing my job," he said, his tone formal yet softened by a trace of warmth. "I'm glad to hear Captain Roberts is doing better." He meant it, though the words felt inadequate against the complexity of his feelings. Emily studied him for a moment, her hazel eyes searching his face as she gathered her thoughts. "Ryan Officer Mitchell told me what happened that night," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "How he treated you. I'm so sorry you went through that. My husband knows now, too, and he's furious it was allowed to happen. We can't erase what Mitchell did, but Ryan's determined to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so are we." Marcus nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but all too aware that promises alone wouldn't heal the wounds left behind. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts," he said simply. "I just hope we can all take something from this, learn from it, do better." She murmured another quiet thanks before slipping out, leaving Marcus with a tangled mix of relief and frustration. It was good to know the incident wouldn't be swept aside, but he also knew justice demanded more than heartfelt words. It required unrelenting effort, the kind he'd spent his life fighting for. Meanwhile, Mitchell was diving headfirst into his own reckoning. The awareness programs he'd enrolled in were grueling, forcing him to confront biases he'd never acknowledged before. At community discussions, he found himself surrounded by voices he'd once ignored, people like Tyrell and Jordan, two brothers whose sharp eyes and guarded postures spoke volumes. Before they even opened their mouths, Tyrell, the older of the two, extended a firm handshake, his grip a silent challenge. "I'm Tyrell, and this is Jordan," he said, nodding toward his brother, whose lean frame buzzed with restless energy. "We're here because, real talk, we don't trust cops, you included, but you showed up, so I guess that's something." Mitchell met their gazes, feeling the weight of their skepticism like a physical force. "I get it," he said, his voice rough but earnest. "I've got a lot to prove, maybe more than I can, but I'm here to listen, to learn." The meeting unfolded with raw intensity. Tyrell and Jordan recounting years of baseless stops and hostile encounters, their words painting a vivid picture of a world Mitchell had never truly seen. He sat there, absorbing every story, every accusation, seeing echoes of Marcus's anger in their ice-cold fury tempered by the faintest thread of hope. "I can't undo what I did," Mitchell said when it was his turn to speak, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his gut. "But I can fight to keep other officers from making the same mistakes. I don't expect you to believe me yet or ever, maybe, but I'll keep coming back. I'll keep showing up, listening, trying. I hope that counts." Tyrell and Jordan exchanged a glance, their expressions softening just enough to hint at surprise. It wasn't trust not yet, but it was a crack in the wall, a sliver of possibility. For Mitchell, it was a lifeline, a fragile thread to cling to on a path fraught with doubt. That same evening, Marcus found himself at the same meeting, drawn by his own restless need to push forward. He froze when he spotted Mitchell in the crowd, his instinct screaming at him to leave, but something curiosity, perhaps, or the nagging pull of purpose kept him rooted in place. As the discussion unfolded, he watched Mitchell's quiet determination, the way he leaned into every word spoken, and a realization settled over him. This was bigger than their clash. It was about the slow, messy work of justice, about the consequences of power unchecked, and about the fragile chance to build something better from the wreckage. For Marcus, It was a lesson etched in every fiber of his being that true change demanded vigilance, not just from those who wielded authority, but from those who dared to hold it accountable. And for Mitchell, it was a humbling truth that redemption wasn't a gift bestowed, but a debt repaid through relentless, unflinching effort. Together, in their fractured way, they were beginning to see it through. The room buzzed with a quiet tension as Ryan Mitchell sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the young man standing before him. Marcus Hayes spoke with a steady rhythm, his words cutting through the air like a blade honed by years of frustration and resolve. Mitchell didn't interrupt, didn't shift in his seat, didn't offer a single word of defense. He simply listened, absorbing every syllable as if they were weights, piling onto his conscience. The crowd around them, neighbors, friends, and strangers alike, watched in rapt silence, their breaths held as if the moment might shatter with the slightest sound. Everyone knew Marcus, the doctor who'd saved lives in the chaos of that fateful night, the man whose quiet strength had become a beacon in their fractured community. And they knew what had happened, how a single encounter had spiraled into a wound that still bled beneath the surface. Marcus's gaze locked onto Mitchell's, unyielding yet not cruel. There was something different in Mitchell's eyes now, a flicker of recognition that hadn't been there when their paths first collided. Back then, Mitchell had been a wall of authority, rigid and unseeing, his uniform a shield against questions he didn't know he needed to ask. But now, as Marcus's voice filled the room, calm yet edged with an unshakable firmness, that wall seemed to crack. This community, Marcus began, his tone a quiet thunder, needs more than promises whispered in good faith. We need action, real, tangible steps forward. We need people who aren't afraid to look in the mirror, to see their own flaws, their own biases, and do something about it. His words weren't just for Mitchell, they rippled outward, rushing against every soul in the room, a call to accountability that no one could ignore. Mitchell nodded slowly, the weight of Marcus's message settling into his bones. He knew those words were a spotlight trained on him, illuminating the mistakes he'd made, the assumptions he'd carried like a badge he didn't even realize he wore. But they were also a challenge to everyone present, a plea to build something better from the ashes of what had been broken. Rising to his feet, he turned to face the group, his voice steady, but laced with a raw honesty that surprised even himself. I know an apology can't wipe away the past, he said, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, all waiting. I don't expect trust to come easy or overnight, but I'm standing here because I want to be part of the answer, not just another piece of the problem. His words hung in the air, fragile yet resolute, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep but was determined to try. The meeting drew to a close with a quiet agreement, a tentative pact sealed in the shared silence of the room. There would be more gatherings, more conversations, and with any luck, more steps toward healing. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus stepped out of the community center into the cool evening air, his heart a tangled knot of hope and weariness. The road ahead loomed long and uncertain, a marathon through a landscape scarred by distrust and pain. Yet, for the first time, he glimpsed a faint shimmer of possibility, small, fragile light piercing the darkness of a tunnel that had felt endless for far too long. Mitchell, meanwhile, lingered behind, watching the last stragglers leave. A strange warmth bloomed in his chest, a sense of renewal he hadn't expected. Redemption, he knew, was a mountain he'd have to climb step by grueling step. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, he felt the first stirrings of certainty. He was finally moving in the right direction. Months had passed since that ninth night that had thrown Marcus Hayes and Ryan Mitchell onto paths neither had foreseen. The incident had been a jagged tear in the fabric of their lives, exposing raw nerves and unspoken truths. The wounds were beginning to scab over, but the scars remained, etched into their skin and their souls, a constant reminder of a confrontation that had rippled beyond them to touch countless others. At the hospital, life churned on in its relentless rhythm-beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, the antiseptic tang of the air. Marcus, still the steady hand guiding patients through their darkest hours, had grown into something more. He wasn't just a doctor now, he was a voice, a force, a man who refused to let the system's flaws fester in silence. His colleagues looked to him with a quiet awe. not just for his skill but for the fire he'd kindled, a crusade for justice that burned brighter with every passing day. In the wake of that night, Marcus had launched a training program at the hospital, a labor of love and necessity. He stood before staff members in crisp white coats and weary scrubs, his presentations a lifeline thrown to those willing to listen. He spoke of implicit biases, of the subtle poisons that seeped into medical care, how a patient's skin color or accent could shift the way a chart was read, a diagnosis made, a life valued. He knew the hospital wasn't a bubble, immune to the injustices that plagued the world outside its walls. Every slide he prepared, every word he spoke, was a brick laid in the foundation of change he was desperate to build. One afternoon, after a marathon of consultations that left his voice hoarse and his mind buzzing, Marcus sat hunched over his desk, refining his next session's notes. His phone pinged, jolting him from his focus. The message was brief, unexpected, an invitation to a community event, signed by none other than Ryan Mitchell. His thumb hovered over the screen, uncertainty curling in his gut. He knew Mitchell was trying, had seen him at meetings, a silent figure in the back, soaking in the words of others rather than preaching his own. But the memory of that night still lingered, heavy and sharp, a blade that hadn't dulled with time. They hadn't spoken since that tense exchange at the cafe, when Mitchell's eyes had been shadowed with guilt and Marcus's heart had been armored with doubt. Yet something tugged at Hymenich to see if Mitchell's promises held weight, or perhaps a deeper need to close a chapter he'd never asked to write. With a sigh, he grabbed his jacket, the fabric cool against his skin, and left the hospital behind, his steps carrying him toward the community center. The center was alive when he arrived, a chaotic symphony of laughter and voices. Children darted through the crowd, their sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, while adults clustered in knots, their conversations a low hum beneath the clamor. On a makeshift stage, Mitchell stood, his broad shoulders squared as he addressed the room. He spoke of new police program, cultural sensitivity training, conflict resolution workshops, his voice steady, carrying a conviction that didn't feel rehearsed. Marcus lingered on the edges, arms crossed, watching. There was no grandstanding in Mitchell's tone, no hollow polish. It was real, raw, a man shedding the skin of who he'd been to become something more. The crowd leaned in, drawn to the shift in him, and Marcus felt it to a quiet pull, urging him closer despite the caution that still coiled in his chest. "We need to rebuild trust," Mitchell said, his voice rising as he reached the end of his speech. "Trust that was shattered by reckless choices, by biases we should have rooted out long ago." His eyes swept the room, then landed on Marcus, holding there for a heartbeat. It wasn't a challenge, but an acknowledgement, a thread of understanding stretching between them across the crowded space. When the applause faded and the stage emptied, Marcus wove through the throng, his steps deliberate. Mitchell stood surrounded by eager faces. Mers Carter from down the street, her voice sharp with questions, young Jamal, who'd once flinched at the sight of a badge, now nodding thoughtfully. But as Marcus approached, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The chatter faded, time stretching thin, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of their shared history crackling in the air. "Dr. Hayes," Mitchell said at last, breaking the silence with a warmth that hadn't been there before. "I'm glad you came." His voice carried a respect that felt earned, not assumed, and Marcus could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, proof of nights spent wrestling with his own demons. "I know I've got a long road ahead, but I'm in this for the right reasons." Marcus tilted his head, weighing the words. He saw the sincerity in Mitchell's eyes, a slow-building fire that had taken months to kindle. "I can see you're trying," he replied, crossing his arms, but letting a faint smile soften the edges of his expression. "And that's what counts. It's not just about fixing your mistakes, it's about making sure no one else has to endure them." Mitchell exhaled, a flicker of relief crossing his features. He knew the past couldn't be undone, but he could wield his badge differently now, could turn it into a tool for progress instead of a weapon of division. "I owe you more than I can say, Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice low but firm, "not just for saving Captain Roberts that night, but for opening my eyes. I can't erase what I did, but I'd like us to work together to make something better." Marcus studied him, then extended his hand, a gesture simple yet heavy with meaning. Mitchell took it, his grip steady, and in that clasp, a pact was forgotten just between two men, but between past and future, pain and possibility. "We can start fresh," Marcus said, his tone even but resolute. "But don't forget, change isn't a destination, it's a choice you make every single day." In the months that followed, Marcus and Mitchell became an unexpected pair. Their collaboration a quiet revolution. They organized events town halls where voices long ignored were finally heard. Workshops where officers and citizens sat side by side, dismantling walls brick by brick. They listened, truly listened, to the stories of people like Mrs. Carter, whose son had faced Mitchell's old prejudices, or Jamal, whose dreams now stretched beyond the fear that once confined him. At one meeting, Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding the room, and introduced Mitchell with a nod. "Officer Mitchell's here to talk about facing ourselves," he said, stepping back to let the man take the stage. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, the spotlight a foreign weight, but he spoke anyway, his voice rough with vulnerability. "I'm not perfect," he admitted, eyes darting to Marcus in the corner. "I've screwed up badly, but every day's a chance to do better, to be better. I'm here because I believe we can build a place where everyone's safe, respected, heard." The room erupted, a wave of applause crashing over him, and as Mitchell stepped down, Marcus met him with a nod. "You did good," he said, sincerity threading through his words. "This is what we need, leadership from people who aren't afraid to grow." Mitchell's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. "All I can do is keep at it," he replied, and as the crowd thinned, they walked out together, shoulder to shoulder, a symbol of something shifting not just in their own hearts, but in the community's fragile trust. Marcus returned to the hospital each day, his vigilance sharper than ever, rooting out the injustices that still lurked in sterile halls. Mitchell, humbled and awake, wore his badge with a new purpose, serving without the blinders he'd once clung to. Their story wasn't just a clash between two men, it was a mirror held up to a system, begging for repair, a testament to the power of small, stubborn steps. They'd learned that justice isn't a gift bestowed from on high. It's a garden cultivated through hard choices, through the courage to face consequences and the will to rewrite them. As they left the community center one evening, the sky ablaze with orange and pink, they carried a shared truth. The work was far from done, but in that moment, walking side by side, they knew they'd found the right path, and in the quiet, steady beat of their footsteps, there was a promise of redemption, of reconciliation, of a future worth fighting for.